Welcome back to Potter Read. Today's tale, Harry mastered the lost wardcraft of the first wizards at age 7 from a founder's buried journal. If you haven't yet, go ahead and smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, The Stone That Would Not Cool. Harry Potter had learned to count everything, because counting was the one thing nobody could take away from him. He counted the stairs above his cupboard, 14, and the ninth one groaned if Dudley trod on it wrong. He counted the seconds Aunt Petunia's kettle took to whistle, which was 91 on a cold morning and 84 on a warm one, so that he could be standing at the stove with the pan already hot before she came down and found a reason to be cross. He counted the spiders in the corner behind the water pipe, though the number changed, and he had decided the changing was the point of spiders. He counted because numbers held still, people did not. On the 3rd of July, which was a Friday and therefore a day when Uncle Vernon left early and came home late, and the house belonged a little more to the women and the boys, Harry was counting weeds. There were, by his tally, 41 dandelions in the border along the back fence, and Aunt Petunia wanted every one of them out by the roots before lunch, or there would be no lunch, and possibly no supper, and a lecture besides about how much they did for him, and how little he gave back. He knelt on the strip of old towel he had folded double because the gravel bit through one layer, and he worked the little hand fork down beside each pale stem and levered slowly, so the root came up whole and did not snap. A snapped root grew back, he had learned that too. Almost everything he knew, he had learned by getting it wrong first and being made to pay for it. The garden at number 4 was a rectangle of ambition. Aunt Petunia had opinions about it that she expressed through Harry's hands. Begonias in ranks like small soldiers. A bird bath nobody had ever seen a bird use. A square of lawn mown so short it looked shaved, and the border, and at the very back where the fence sagged and the neighbors could not see, a patch of stony ground that had never grown anything but couch grass and the resentment of whoever was told to dig it. Today Harry was told to dig it. "Turn it over," Aunt Petunia had said through the kitchen window, in the voice she used when she was giving him a punishment and calling it a chore so she would not have to feel like a woman who punished a 7-year-old. "Write down, I want it ready for the paving man." There was no paving man, there was never a paving man, there was only the turning over, which was hard, and the ground, which was harder. He liked it anyway, in the private way he had learned to like things without letting his face say so. Out here the sky was very high and very blue and did not belong to the Dursleys. The couch grass smelled green and bitter when he pulled it. A blackbird sat on the sagging fence and watched him with one bright eye and did not fly away, which he took as a kind of arrangement between them. He worked the spade in and rocked it and lifted, and the earth came up in wet black slabs, and he thought about nothing, which was the best thing he was ever allowed to think about. The spade rang, not the dull chalk of a stone. A ring, thin and long, that traveled up the wooden handle and into the small bones of his hands, and sat there humming after the sound itself had stopped. He knelt and put his fingers to the ground where the noise had come from and felt the cold of it before he saw anything at all. A cold that did not belong to July, a cold that came up out of the earth like water rising in a cellar. Harry cleared the soil with his hands. He did it the careful way because he was a careful boy, and because whatever was down there had rung like something that did not want to be broken. It was a stone. A flat stone, gray going to green, the size of a dinner tray, set level in the ground by some hand that had laid it there on purpose and meant it to stay. Around its edge ran a line of marks. He rubbed the dirt from one with his thumb. It was not writing he knew. It was not letters. It was a shape like a fork of lightning caught mid-strike and made to hold still, and beside it a ring with a bar through it, and beside that 3 lines leaning the same way, like rain or like grass in wind. The marks went all the way round. Someone had cut them one at a time with a patience Harry could feel in his own teeth. He should tell Aunt Petunia. That was the rule, and the rule was written into him the way the multiplication tables were written into Dudley by force and never took. Strangeness must be reported and then confiscated and then held against him. A stone with marks was strange. Strange things at number 4 were his fault by definition, whether he had made them or merely found them. He did not tell Aunt Petunia. Instead he sat back on his heels in the turned earth and looked at the stone as he might look at a sum he had not been taught yet, but suspected he could do anyway, if he was let alone with it long enough. The cold came off it in a steady breath. He put his palm flat on the cut marks, and the cold ran up his arm and settled behind his ribs, and it was not unpleasant. It was like the moment before the kettle whistled, when he knew the sound was coming and exactly when. He got the spade under the edge of the stone and heaved. It did not move. He tried the other edge and the near corner and the far corner, kneeling and pushing until the muscles across his back stood out and quivered, and the stone lay in the ground and paid him no attention at all. It was too big or too deep or too heavy, or it did not wish to come. He was 7 and he weighed less than a sack of the compost Aunt Petunia bought in spring, and the stone had been in the ground since before the road was a road, and it knew both those things. Harry sat and considered. A locked door has a key, and a stuck jar has a knack, and a sum has a trick you have not been shown. He had learned that too, though nobody had taught it to him on purpose. The world was full of things that would not open by pushing, and every one of them opened by something else, and the trick was to stop pushing and start looking. He looked. He wiped the whole face of the stone clean with the flat of his hand and his spit and the hem of Dudley's old shirt, and he found that the marks were not a border only. There was one mark set apart from the rest, near the middle, deeper than the others, with a cup worn into the bottom of it by 1,000 thumbs that had pressed there before his. It was a shape like an eye that was also a seed, or a seed that had decided to become an eye. He put his thumb in the cup because his thumb fitted it and pressed because pressing was what the cup was for. The stone grew warm under his hand, not warm like sunlight. Warm like a living thing that had been holding still and now had decided to move. The cold went out of it all at once, the way frost goes off a window when you breathe on it, and something turned over deep beneath him, some counterweight the size of a church bell, and the flat stone rose an inch out of the earth on its own and stopped there, floating, with black soil sifting off its underside in threads. Harry did not run. He wanted the record to show later to himself, in the ledger he kept behind his eyes, that he had not run. His whole body had told him to, every animal part of him that knew a boy should not kneel in a garden while a stone taught itself to fly. He held the towel-folded knees of his trousers with both fists, and he did not run, because the not running was the only brave thing available to him, and he took it. The stone slid sideways. It moved the way a heavy drawer moves when the runners are true, without hurry, without effort, as if the whole weight of it had been set on rails 1,000 years ago by someone who understood exactly how frightened a person might be at this moment, and had built the thing to be gentle about it. It came to rest on the turned earth beside the hole it had left, and it settled, and the garden was quiet, and the blackbird on the fence had gone. Under the stone was a hollow. It was not the ragged hollow a stone leaves in ground. It was made. The sides were lined with more of the flat gray rock, fitted so close he could not have got a fingernail between them, and the marks ran down the walls of it in columns, tidy as knitting, and at the bottom, on a shelf of stone cut for the purpose, lay a box. Box was black metal gone the deep brown of old blood, bound about with straps of a paler metal that had not rusted, though everything iron in the Dursleys' garden shed rusted if you looked at it wrong. There was no lock. There was a single band across the lid, and on the band a mark like the eye seed on the stone, and beneath the mark the box waited with the terrible patience of a thing that has waited before and knows how it is done. Harry reached into the earth and lifted it out. He had braced for the weight. There was almost none. The box was the size of the family Bible that lived on the good shelf and was never read, and it should have weighed like stone and iron, and instead it came up into his arms as light as the kettle when it was empty, and it was warm and it was dry. That was the thing that made the hair stand up along his arms. It was dry. It had lain in wet black English earth under a stone that wept cold, and when he turned it over in his hands there was not a bead of water on it anywhere, not a smear of soil, not the pale bloom that grows on anything long buried. It was as dry and clean as if it had been set down that morning by a careful hand, and hidden not for 1,000 years, but for the length of one bad afternoon. Something had kept the wet out. Something had kept the cold in the stone above and the dry in the box below, all this time on purpose, the way Harry kept the pan hot before the kettle whistled. Somebody had planned this. Somebody had knelt where he knelt, no matter how long ago that was, and had built a thing to survive until a person came who could lift the stone and had trusted the person to come. Aunt Petunia's voice cut across the garden like a wire. "What are you doing back there? I don't hear digging." Harry moved before he had finished deciding to. He set the box down in the hole where the couch grass grew thickest and dragged the turned earth over it with his forearm and knelt on the spot and had the spade in his hands and was levering up a slab of soil, all in the time it took her voice to travel the length of the lawn. It was a skill he had. He was very good at being found doing the thing he was supposed to be doing, whatever he had been doing the moment before. "I'm digging, Aunt Petunia," he called, and made the spade ring off a real stone so she could hear it working. Her face appeared at the corner of the house, pink and narrow under her set hair. She looked at the turned ground, at the sweat on him, at the dirt to his elbows, and found nothing to complain of, which made her mouth go thin, because Aunt Petunia was a woman who ran on complaint the way the car ran on petrol and did not like to arrive anywhere with the tank still full. "Lunch is at 1. If it's not done by 1, there's no lunch, and wash before you come in. I won't have you tramping it through my kitchen." She looked once more at the garden, at the flat gray stone lying on the grass where no stone had been that morning, and Harry's whole insides went to ice, and her eyes passed over it and did not stop. They slid off it. She frowned, the frown of a person who has forgotten what they came into a room for, and turned and went back inside, and the door clicked, and Harry knelt in the dirt and breathed. She had not seen the stone. It had been a foot from her eye line, a great flat slab of green-gray rock the size of a tray, sitting on her precious shaved lawn where she would have noticed a fallen leaf, and she had looked directly at it, and her gaze had run off it like water off wax. Harry looked at the stone. The stone looked, in its blind mineral way, back. He was beginning to understand, in the wordless part of himself that ran ahead of the thinking part and was usually right, that he had found something that did not want to be seen, and that not wanting to be seen was a thing this stone could do, and that a boy who was punished for being noticed might give a great deal to learn how a stone did that. He did the sums first because he was a boy who did the sums. If he took the box inside now, he would have to carry it past Aunt Petunia, who could not see the stone but might well see a box, and if she saw the box she would take it, and if she took it he would never get it back, and whatever it was would go the way the toy soldier had gone, and the good pencil, and the picture he had drawn of a family that was not the Dursleys. Things that were his did not stay his. That was a law of the house as fixed as the 14 stairs. But if he left the box in the ground, the paving man who did not exist might, for once, exist and dig and find it. Unlikely. But Harry had learned to fear the unlikely, because the unlikely was where his luck lived. He dug on until the ground along the fence was turned right down as she had asked, and he did it well, because doing it well bought him hours of not being watched. And then, when the turning was done and the sun stood over the roof, and the house was quiet with the particular quiet of Aunt Petunia doing her hair for no reason and Dudley in front of the television growing, Harry lifted the box out of the hole a second time, and carried it not to the house but to the shed. The shed at number 4 was Uncle Vernon's in theory, and therefore nobody's, because Uncle Vernon believed in garden equipment much as he believed in exercise, as a thing that ought to exist for other men. It smelled of creosote and old grass and the Swedish rot of a bag of bulbs somebody had forgotten. Behind the mower in the dark triangle where the roof came down to the wall, there was a gap Harry had found the summer before and told no one about, because a boy who lives in a cupboard learns to collect small darknesses the way other boys collect marbles. He slid the box into the gap. He piled a coil of hose and an empty paint tin in front of it. He stood back and looked and could not see it and knew where it was, and that was the difference between him and Aunt Petunia, and he thought about that difference for a long time. Then he went and washed to the elbow and ate the lunch that came at 1, which was a cheese sandwich with the cheese counted out thin, and he said thank you, and he did not once look toward the garden or the shed, and inside the counting part of him a clock had started that would not stop until it was dark and the house was asleep, and he could go and open the box. The Dursleys went to bed at 10:30, all three, because Aunt Petunia believed early nights kept a person young and Uncle Vernon believed whatever Aunt Petunia believed loudly enough, and Dudley went because he was made to and cried about it through the wall. By 11 the house was breathing its night breath, the fridge shuddering, the pipes ticking as they cooled, the ninth stair still and silent because no one was on it. Harry lay in his cupboard on the thin mattress with his glasses folded on the shelf by his head and his eyes open in the dark, counting the fridge's shutters, and when he had counted 40 of them and heard Uncle Vernon's snore settle into the long deep saw that meant true sleep, he got up. He had learned the house the way a mouse learns a house, by which floorboards forgave you and which betrayed you. He went out through the kitchen door, which he had oiled in April with a drop from the can meant for the mower, telling himself at the time he did not know why. He crossed the wet grass in his bare feet, cold and clean between his toes, and let himself into the shed, and moved the paint tin and the hose, and took the box out into the moonlight that came gray and generous through the open door. He set it on the potting bench. He put his thumb in the cup of the mark on the band, because the stone had taught him that much, that the marks with cups worn into them were made for thumbs, and he pressed. The band did not open. Instead, a line of light ran round it, thin as a hair, the color of the sky just before dawn, and where the light passed the metal parted, not springing but yielding, the way skin yields to warmth, and the lid rose of its own accord an inch and stopped, and out of the box came a smell. It was not the smell of a shed or a garden or anything in Little Winging. It was the smell of a place Harry had never been and knew at once, the way you know a word in a language you have never learned but somehow always spoke. Cold stone and green water and wood smoke and something under all of it, high and clean and faintly sweet, like the air after lightning, like the moment the kettle knew it was going to whistle. He breathed it in and his eyes stung, and he did not know why, and he let them. Inside the box, wrapped in cloth that had once been the deep green of moss and was now the gray of ash, lay a book. It was bound in the same dark metal as the box, hinged like a real book down its spine, and it was thicker than the family Bible, and heavy in a way the box had not been, so that when he lifted it out it pulled his wrists down and he had to set it flat on the bench to open it. The cover had a single mark on it, cut deep and inlaid with a wire of that pale unrusting metal, the eye that was a seed, the seed that was an eye. He put his finger to it and it was warm. He opened the book. The pages were not paper. They were thin as paper and pale as the inside of a shell, and they did not tear when his careless finger caught one, and they were covered, every one edge to edge, with writing, not the marks from the stone, writing. Rows of it, small and even and made by a hand that had been in no hurry, in ink that had gone the brown of old blood like the box, so faint in places he had to tilt the page to the moonlight to catch it at all. It was English, or nearly English, gone strange and old, the way the vicar's words at the one funeral he had been taken to had been English and not, full of these and shalls and words that leaned backward into a time before number 4, before Privet Drive, before the road. Harry could read. He had taught himself the hard parts out of Dudley's schoolbooks, sounding out in the cupboard by torchlight the words the teacher went too fast for, because reading was another thing they could not take once it was in. He bent over the book and read the first line, mouthing it under his breath, and the words were these: "To thee that hath lifted the stone." He stopped, he read it again. His thumb was resting on the page below the line, on a patch where the ink had faded almost to nothing, and where his thumb touched, the ink darkened. It came up out of the page like a bruise coming up under skin, brown going to black, sharp and clear, and letters he had not been able to read a moment before arranged themselves into a second line beneath the first, and the second line said, "For none but such could, and none but such was meant to." Harry took his thumb off the page. His hand was shaking, and he watched it shake with the detached interest he brought to everything about his own body, which had never been quite his own. He put his thumb back. Where he touched, the writing woke. He drew his thumb slowly down the page, and the ink followed it, brightening, and a whole paragraph rose out of the pale nothing into legibility, and he read it by the grey light of the moon in a garden shed in Surrey, and this is what it said: "I write for one I shall not meet, in a hand that shall be dust before thy eyes learn their letters. I do not know thy name. I know only that the stone will not lift for the cruel, nor for the careless, nor for the merely curious, for I made it so, and I made it well, and I have never yet made a thing that failed. So thou art none of those. Thou art careful, and thou art in need, or thou wouldst not have dug so deep in ground that promised nothing. Careful and in need, that is the whole of what a warder starts from. All the rest can be taught. I taught myself, and I was less than thou once, and smaller and more afraid." Harry read it 3 times. The shed was very quiet. Somewhere a long way off a car went by, and its sound came and grew and faded, and belonged to another world, the world of Uncle Vernon and the paving man who did not exist, and the 14 stairs, and Harry sat with the book open under his hands, and understood that he had crossed out of that world into this one, and there was no lifting the stone back over the hole. He read on. The writing woke as he asked it to, page after page, and he learned 3 things that night in the shed, and he wrote none of them down because there was nowhere safe to write them, and instead he did what he had always done and put them in the ledger behind his eyes where numbers were kept. The first thing was a name, given plainly on the second page, the writer done with mystery. I was called Helga. In the years I had a name that men used. There was more after it, a line about a school and 3 others who built it with her, and a falling out she did not explain. But Harry's eye caught on the name and held there, because it was a soft, round, ordinary name, a name like a person, and it did not match the stone that flew, or the box that stayed dry, or the ink that woke to his thumb, and the not matching told him something true. That the enormous old magic in his hands had been made by somebody who had once been a child in a garden, careful and in need, exactly as he was. The second thing was harder, and he only half understood it, and the half he understood in his teeth before his head. The writing called itself, and the craft it taught, by a word: warding. There was a great deal about warding. It was, Helga wrote, the oldest magic in the first, older than the wand-waving and the potion brewing and the changing of one thing into another, older than the school and the 4 of them and the falling out. Before ever a wizard learned to make, she wrote, a wizard learned to keep the fire in and the wolf out, to keep the roof up and the flood down, to keep the child safe while the mother slept. The first wizards were not makers, they were keepers. They were warders, and the world has forgotten them and forgotten the keeping and gone chasing after the making, which is louder and prettier and worth, in the end, a great deal less. There was a bitterness in the line that Harry recognized, because he had felt it himself, the bitterness of a thing that does the real work and is not thanked. The third thing was the smallest, and it changed everything, and it was this. Near the bottom of the 4th page, where the writing had gone very faint and he had to breathe on it and press with the whole flat of his thumb to bring it up, Helga had written a single instruction, set apart from the rest, in letters slightly larger, meant to be the first thing a careful and needful child would want, saved for the moment they were ready to be trusted with it. If thou art hunted, she wrote, or watched, or merely tired of being seen, then learn thou this before all else, for it is the smallest keeping and the mother of the rest. It is called the hush. And below the word she had drawn a mark, 3 lines leaning the same way, like rain or like grass in wind, the mark he had seen on the rim of the stone, and beneath the mark a sentence in her old strange English that told him, plainly and without flourish, exactly how the mark was to be made and where and with what, so that a thing marked with it would slip out of the notice of any eye that looked, the way the stone had slipped out of Aunt Petunia's. Harry read the instruction 11 times. He counted the readings. On the 11th he closed his eyes and found the whole of it waiting in the ledger, the shape of the mark and the placing of it and the turn of the mind that Helga said must go with it, which she called meaning it, and which she said was the hardest part and the only part that could not be written down, and which she trusted him, a child she would never meet, to find in himself. He opened his eyes. The moon had moved. The grey light had crept along the potting bench and left the book half in shadow. It must be past midnight. The cold clock in him said past 2. He should go in. If Uncle Vernon woke and found the cupboard empty, there would be no accounting for it, no sum that came out right, and the box and the book and the whole strange country he had crossed into would be discovered and confiscated and held against him forever. He looked down at his own hand where it rested on the open page, and then at the paint tin that hid the gap in the shed wall, and he thought about the hush, and he decided to try it once, only once, on something small before he lost his nerve. There was a stub of chalk on the potting bench, the blue chalk Uncle Vernon used to mark the mower blade, and there was Harry's own left hand, which was the smallest and least important thing in the shed that also belonged entirely to him. He took the chalk in his right hand. He drew on the back of his left hand the 3 leaning lines, careful even with the patience of whoever had cut the border of the stone. And then he did the part that could not be written down. He looked at his own marked hand, and he thought with the whole of himself, the thought Helga had given him without giving him the words for it. Not there, nothing to see, look past. He thought it as he thought the pan hot before the kettle whistled, knowing the thing before it was true, and he held the knowing steady, and he waited. Nothing happened. His hand was a hand with blue chalk on it. He felt foolish, 7 years old and barefoot in a shed at 2 in the morning, drawing on himself and expecting the world to look away, and the foolishness came almost as a rest, because foolishness belonged to the old world, the safe, small world, and for a moment he was back in it and did not mind. Then he noticed that he could not quite see his hand. He could see it. It was there, but his eye did not want to rest on it. It slid the way Aunt Petunia's gaze had slid off the stone, off his own marked hand and onto the potting bench and the paint tin and the coil of hose, and he had to drag his gaze back by force, by naming his own fingers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the ledger. And even then, when he was looking straight at his hand and knew it was his and counting its fingers, the hand felt somehow like a thing seen through water, present and remote at once, there and asked to be elsewhere. He wiped the chalk off on his trousers. His hand came back, the whole of it near and solid in his 5 fingers, a scab on the knuckle, the blue smear fading. He stood in the moonlight with his heart going and his eyes stinging again for no reason he could name, and he understood that the smallest keeping, the mother of the rest, had answered him. Clumsy, half-made, a drawing on a hand that a real warder would have laughed at, but it had answered. He had asked the world to look away, and the world had just begun to obey. He was 7 years old, and he had done magic that no living wizard remembered how to do, though he did not know the second part of that yet, the no living wizard part. He knew only the first part, which was enough, which was everything. That he had found a thing that was his, truly his, that could not be taken because it was not in his hand or his cupboard, but in the ledger behind his eyes where no one could reach, and that tomorrow he would learn the next thing, and the day after that the thing after, and that somewhere a woman named Helga, who had once been a careful child in need, had built a stone to wait 1,000 years for exactly him. He wrapped the book in its ash-gray cloth and set it in the box and pressed the band shut, and the hair-thin line of dawn-colored light ran round it and sealed, and he hid it in the gap behind the paint tin, and he crossed the wet grass to the house with his bare feet going numb, and he let himself in through the old door, and he lay down on the thin mattress in the cupboard under the 14 stairs, and he did not sleep. He lay in the dark and drew the 3 leaning lines over and over on the inside of his own eyelids, and outside the cupboard the house breathed its night breath, and the fridge shuddered, and Harry counted the shudders, and behind the counting, steady and new and entirely his own, the smallest keeping hummed like a thing that had waited a very long time to be asked. Morning came as it always came at number 4, with Uncle Vernon's alarm and the thump of his feet and the run of the pipes as he ran the tap too hot and complained about it. Harry was up before any of it, because he was always up before any of it, laying the table and turning the bacon and doing the 7 small tasks that kept the house from turning on him. But this morning he did them with the blue chalk in his pocket, wrapped in a twist of newspaper, and behind his eyes he was not counting bacon. He was working a sum. The sum was this. Last night in the dark in a shed on his own hand the hush had answered. But a shed at 2 in the morning was an easy place to believe in magic. The kitchen at 7:30, with the toaster going and Aunt Petunia's radio muttering the weather and Uncle Vernon's newspaper making its angry paper noises, was the hardest place in England to believe in anything at all. If the hush worked here in the bright ordinary daylight of the Dursleys, then it was real, and if it did not, then he had dreamed it, and it was better to know. He needed something to test it on that would not get him hit if it went wrong. He looked at the marmalade. The marmalade lived in a cut glass dish that came out only for Uncle Vernon, who took it on his second slice of toast, thickly, and grew red doing it. If the marmalade were simply not noticed, no one would be punished. A man who fails to reach for marmalade has lost nothing he can name. Harry set the dish on the table in its usual place, and while Aunt Petunia's back was turned to the grill, he took the twist of chalk from his pocket, and under the lip of the tablecloth where no eye would fall on the wood of the table itself, in a space the width of 2 fingers, he drew the 3 leaning lines. Then he set the dish exactly over them. He did the part that could not be written down. He looked at the marmalade and he thought, with the whole quiet weight of himself, as he thought the pan hot before the whistle, nothing there, not for reaching, look past. He held it while he carried the teapot to the table, and while he set out the milk, and while Uncle Vernon came down grumbling and dropped into his chair and shook out his paper, and Harry did not once let the knowing waver, and he did not once look at the marmalade himself, because Helga's page had said a thing he had turned over in the night until he understood it. The hush turns away the seeking eye, but it cannot turn away the eye that already knows. The warder must forget with the rest, or hold the knowing so still it makes no ripple. He held it still. Uncle Vernon ate his first slice dry. He reached for the butter and the salt and the pot of tea, and his hand passed twice over the cut glass dish that sat a foot from his elbow catching the light, and twice his hand came back with something else, and his eyes, which missed nothing that might be used against Harry, slid across the marmalade and away, and a crease came and went between his brows, the crease of a man who has walked into a room and forgotten his purpose. And then the paper claimed him again, and the marmalade sat on the table full and orange and entirely unseen. Harry stood by the counter with the tea towel in his hands and watched a grown man fail, for 4 full minutes, to notice the one thing on the table he loved best, and he understood 3 things at once, and he counted them because counting held them still. The first was that it was real, not a dream, not a shed at 2 in the morning. Real in the daylight, real at the Dursleys' own table, real enough to make Uncle Vernon's hand turn aside from marmalade he would have crossed a road for. Whatever he had crossed into last night, he had not crossed back out of in his sleep. It had come with him into the morning. It was his. The second was that it was small, and that its smallness was a kind of gift, because small things went unpunished. Nobody would ever be beaten for marmalade. A boy who could turn away the seeking eye from a glass dish could, in time, turn it away from a bruise, from a torn shirt, from a cupboard door left open, from himself. He had spent every day of his rememberable life trying to be less seen, hunching, hurrying, keeping to walls, and it had never once worked, because a boy trying not to be seen is the most visible thing in any room. Here, drawn under a tablecloth in blue chalk, was the thing he had been reaching for with his whole body and never touched. The third thing he did not have words for, and it was the largest, and it sat under the other 2 the way the counterweight had sat under the stone. It was that somebody had known. A woman named Helga, dust 1,000 years, had known that a careful and needful child would want before all else to not be seen, and had saved that lesson for him and set it apart in larger letters and trusted him to mean it. Nobody at number 4 had ever known what Harry wanted. Nobody had ever set a thing apart and saved it and trusted him with it. He stood with the tea towel and the marmalade going unseen, and something moved in his chest that he had no shelf for, and he put it, for now, in the ledger, unnamed, to be looked at later when he was alone. "You're gawping," said Aunt Petunia, and he stopped gawping, and the morning went on. When the breakfast was cleared, he wiped the chalk from under the tablecloth with a wet finger, and the marmalade came back into the world with a suddenness that made Aunt Petunia frown at it and say to no one that she was sure she'd put that away, and Harry said nothing and washed the dishes and did not smile, because a boy who smiles at nothing gets asked what he is smiling at. But inside the ledger behind the counting, the sum had come out. It balanced. The hush was real, and it was his, and there was a whole book of it waiting in the dark behind a paint tin, page after page of keeping older than the wand and the potion and the school, and tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, he would go and learn the next of it. That night he went back out across the wet grass, and he opened the box, and he set his thumb to the 5th page where the ink lay pale and sleeping, and he began to read the next of it. Across the road, in a house that smelled of cabbage and cat, an old woman stood at her dark window with a tabby against her ankles and looked at number 4 for a while and frowned and could not have said why and drew her curtain and went to bed. Harry did not see her. He was bent over a book older than the road, in a shed the size of a grave, learning the second keeping by the light of the moon, and he was 7 years old, and he had only just begun. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The old grammar Harry made a study of the book as he made a study of everything, slowly, in secret, and without asking anyone's leave. He could not take it into the house. That was the first law he set himself, and he set it the morning after the marmalade, sitting on the cold floor of the cupboard with his knees drawn up, working out where the danger lived. The danger did not live in the shed. Uncle Vernon never went in it, and Aunt Petunia would not touch the mower for the sake of her hands, and Dudley kept well clear of the dark triangle where the roof came down, having once been shut in there by a cousin he no longer spoke to. The danger lived in the house, where things that were Harry's were only ever Harry's until someone decided otherwise. So the book stayed in the shed in the gap behind the paint tin, and Harry went to it and did not bring it to himself, and this rule cost him, and he kept it anyway, which was the only kind of rule worth setting. He went at night when he could, and he learned the shape of the going, out through the old kitchen door, across the grass, counting his own footsteps so he would take the same number back and know if he had wandered into the shed. The paint tin moved and replaced, the box opened with his thumb in the worn cup. He learned to work by moonlight, and on the nights the moon failed him, he learned to work by the small torch he had rescued from the dustbin the winter before and mended with a rubber band, putting it in his cupped hand so no line of light would show under the shed door. He learned, in short, to be a boy who studied in the dark, which suited him, because the dark asked nothing of him and told no one what it saw, and he learned that the book was not a book of spells. That surprised him, and it took him 3 nights to understand why, and the understanding changed how he thought about all of it. Dudley had a comic once, a bright ruined thing with a wizard on the cover, and in it magic was words you shouted while pointing a stick, and the words did the magic and the stick aimed it, and that was the whole of the theory as far as the comic went. Harry had assumed, without examining the assumption, that Helga's book would be a longer, older version of the comic, harder words, a better stick. It was not. Helga did not give him words to shout, she gave him a grammar, that was her word for it. He came to it on the 6th page, where the ink woke thick and dark under his thumb as though she had pressed harder writing it, wanting it seen. Thou wilt look for spells and find none, and think me a poor teacher. Be patient. A spell is a sentence someone else has written for thee, and thou art to say it in hope. I will not teach thee to say, I will teach thee to write. Learn the grammar, and thou needest no man's sentences ever again, but mayst make thine own to fit the need before thee, which is never twice the same need. The makers gave up the grammar for the sentences, because sentences are quicker to sell and quicker to learn, and so the world has 1,000 spells and not one wizard in an age who could build a new one from the ground. We were builders, be thou a builder. Harry read that 4 times, and something in it lay down inside him and fit, the way a key fits that you have been trying in a lock in the dark, and suddenly it turns. He had never been given a sentence to say in hope. He had been given, all his life, the results of other people's sentences and told to accept them. A grammar was a different thing entirely. A grammar was a set of rules you could hold up to the light and turn over and use to make sentences nobody had ever said. A grammar meant that once you had it, no one could run out of it for you. So he learned the grammar, and it went like this. A word, Helga wrote, is a sentence, and every true sentence has 4 parts, and if any of the 4 is missing, the sentence is only a noise. The first part is the keeping, what is to be kept. The second is the doing, what is to be done. The third is the standing against what the doing is done. And the fourth, the deepest, the one the makers forgot first and most completely, is the anchor, where the sentence is to live, for a sentence must live somewhere in something, or it says itself once into the air and is gone. Harry drew it out for himself in the dust of the shed floor with his finger, 4 boxes, and gave them his own words, because Helga's old words were beautiful and slippery, and his own were plain and held still. Keeping, what you protect. Doing, turn away or hold or bind or unmake. Standing against, from what, anchor, where it lives. He looked at the 4 boxes and thought about the hush he had already made, and he saw, with the clean click of a sum coming out, that he had made a whole sentence at the breakfast table without knowing its grammar. The keeping was the marmalade, the doing was turn away, the standing against was the seeking eye, the anchor was the 3 chalk lines under the dish, 4 parts, a true sentence. He had spoken it by luck and instinct, meaning it hard enough that the grammar had assembled itself behind his back, and now he had the grammar in front of him, and he need never trust to luck again. He tested the grammar as he tested everything, which was to break it on purpose and watch what fell out. If a word was a sentence with 4 parts, then a word with a part missing should fail, and it should fail in a way that told him which part he had left out, the way a sum done wrong tells you where the mistake is if you're willing to look. So he made bad words. He made them small and harmless, out in the shed where no one would feel them, and he studied the wreckage. He made a hush with no anchor, 3 chalk lines drawn on his palm and then rubbed away, and he found that it lived exactly as long as he held his hand still and thinking, and died the instant his mind wandered, because a sentence with nowhere to live must be carried, and a boy cannot carry a thing and also sleep. He made a hush with no standing against, a turn away that named no enemy, and he found that it turned away nothing or everything, flickering, useless, a door that swung both ways in a wind. He made a keeping with a doing but no keeping mark at the head of it, and it did not so much fail as never begin, the letters lying dead on the wood like a word spelled with all its vowels left out. Each failure was a fact, and he collected facts. He learned that the anchor did not have to be touched, only near, because a mark on the underside of the potting bench held a hush over the whole bench without his hand upon it, which meant a warder could hide a thing and then walk away from it, which meant the marmalade did not need him standing over it, which changed everything about what the craft was for. He learned that the enemy could be named by kind or by name, and that naming by name was stronger and narrower, so that a ward set against Dudley by name paid no attention to the postman at all. And he understood, turning that over, that the old grammar was not a fence you built around a thing, but a set of instructions you gave to the thing itself, patient instructions, waiting instructions, and that the difference mattered, though he could not yet have said why it made the hair lift on his arms to think it. The letters were the words of the grammar, and there were more of them than he had thought. The 3 leaning lines were only 1. Helga gave them to him a few at a time, never many in a night, and always with a warning that a letter unpracticed was a letter unlearned, and that a warder who collected letters like a boy collecting stamps and never wrote a true sentence with them was worse than useless. He was a danger, because half-learned keeping fails at the worst moment, which is the only moment keeping is asked for. So Harry did not race ahead. He learned a letter and he wrote with it over and over small true sentences on scraps and stones in the back of his own hand, until the letter lived in his fingers and not only in the ledger behind his eyes, and only then did he turn the page for the next. He learned the letter for turn away, which was the leaning lines. He learned the letter for hold fast, which was a ring closed on itself with a bar across, the mark he had seen on the rim of the stone. He learned the letter for cross knot, which was a line with a smaller line laid over it near the top, like a low fence or a threshold. He learned the letter for the keeping itself, the letter you set at the head of a sentence to say this here is what matters, and he learned that this letter, more than any other, drank the meaning it out of a warder, because to say this is what matters and mean it with the whole self was to admit that something mattered, and Harry found, working alone in the dark, that admitting a thing mattered was harder for him than any letter, and he did not look too closely at why. He practiced the holdfast on the box itself, because the box was iron and iron remembers, and because a book that taught you to keep things ought to be a thing you could keep. He drew the ring and bar on the inside of the lid where his own eye alone would find it, and he set the standing against as narrow as he could make it, not everyone, not any hand, but any hand that is not mine, reaching to open, and he anchored it in the band with the worn cup, and he meant it. Then he tested it, which was the part that was most his own, because testing a ward was a thing the book never told him to do, and he did anyway. He tried to open the box as Dudley would open it, greedy and careless, thinking give me that, and the lid would not lift for him. The band held cold and shut under a thumb that pressed it as a thief presses. Then he thought of himself plainly, this is mine, and the light ran round and the lid rose. He had built a lock that knew the difference between him and a stranger, out of a ring, a bar, and a drop of meaning, and he sat in the dark turning the shut box over in his hands and thinking that there was not a lock in the whole of Privet Drive, not on Uncle Vernon's car nor Aunt Petunia's jewelry box, that could tell one hand from another. His could. He mended his glasses next, and that was the first time the craft crossed over into his daytime life, and it taught him something he had not gone looking for. The left arm of his glasses had been broken since Easter, snapped at the hinge by Dudley in a corridor and set again by Harry with a winding of sticky tape that grayed and slipped and let the lens drop at the worst moments, in the middle of a chore in front of a teacher, so that he was forever pushing them up a nose too small to hold them. He could not ask for them to be fixed, asking cost more than the fixing was worth. So one night he cleaned the tape away and laid the two halves of the broken arm together on the bench, true and touching, and he drew the holdfast across the join so small he needed the torch and one eye shut to place it, and the standing against he named was the simplest he had ever set, only this, coming apart. He meant it as he meant the box, hold, do not come apart, live in the metal and hold. The join knit under his hands, not melted, not soldered. The two edges of the broken metal simply agreed to be one edge, the seam going from a bright line to a gray line to no line at all. And when he lifted the glasses and worked the arm on its hinge, it moved clean and firm and did not slip, and it held the next morning, and the morning after, and every morning through a school year in which Dudley stood on them once on purpose, and they did not so much as bend. He wore a repair no optician had made and no one could see, and the not being seen of it was worth more to him than the mending, because it meant the craft could sit on his face all day in front of the hole of little winging, and no eye would ever catch it, which was, he was beginning to understand, the whole genius of the old magic. It did its work and left no boast behind. The threshold was the first true ward he built on a place instead of a thing, and he built it on his cupboard, and it took him 11 nights. He wanted the cupboard kept. That was the keeping, and it was easy to mean because the cupboard was the one place in the house that was his, as the shed book was his, and a boy learns to love a poor thing fiercely when it is the only thing he has. The doing was cross knot. He wanted a line drawn that the unwelcome could not step over. The standing against took him a while, because Helga was very clear that a ward whose standing against was too wide would fail, would try to keep out everything and so keep out nothing, would exhaust its anchor snapping at the postman and the milk in the ordinary traffic of a house. Name the enemy narrow, she wrote, and the ward stands narrow and strong. Name it wide, and the ward stands wide and weak is worse than nothing, for it makes thee bold when thou shouldst be careful. So Harry sat on the cupboard floor and thought hard about who, exactly, he wished kept out, and he found that it was not everyone. It was the reaching hand. It was Aunt Petunia's arm coming in to drag out a boy who had overslept. It was Dudley's foot on the door for the fun of the bang. It was the unwelcome intent to do him harm or to take his things, and when he named it that narrowly, the standing against went from a fog to a blade, and he understood something about himself that he put in the ledger and did not name, that he did not in the end want to keep the whole world out. He wanted to keep out only the part of it that hurt him. That was a smaller thing to want and a stranger one, and it was true. The anchor cost him the 11 nights. An anchor, Helga wrote, is where the sentence lives, and it must be a thing that will stay where the keeping is, and it must be given by the warder, a name that only the warder knows, for the name is the handle by which the warder holds the ward after it is made, and an anchor with no secret name is a ward that runs wild and cannot be called back. Harry looked around his cupboard for a thing that would stay. Not the mattress, it might be taken. Not the shelf, it was the houses. In the end he chose a nail. There was a nail in the back wall of the cupboard, low down, bent, driven in crooked by some workman years before and never used, and it was iron, and Helga had written that iron holds a keeping better than wood or stone because iron remembers, and Harry did not know what that meant and believed it anyway. He cleaned the nail with spit and the corner of his shirt. He drew the letters on the wall around it, the head letter for keeping, the fence letter for cross-knot, the narrow name of the enemy in the letters she had given him for reaching and taking and harm. And then he gave the anchor its secret name, and the name he gave it was the name of nobody, a sound he made up that meant nothing in any language, 3 syllables he would never say aloud where a living soul could hear, and he wrote the name into the nail with his thumb and his blood, a bead of it from a thumb he pressed against the bent iron point, and he meant it. He meant the whole sentence with the whole of himself. This is mine, keep out the hand that would take it, live here in the iron. Come when I call you by the name that is only mine. The blood went into the iron and did not run. It sank, the beat of it, the way water sinks into dry sand, gone in a breath, and where it had been the nail was clean and cold, and around the nail the 11 nights' work of letters seemed to settle into the wall, going quiet, going still, the way a dog settles when it has finally been given a job and understands it. Harry sat back against the mattress with his thumb in his mouth and the iron taste on his tongue, and he waited to feel like a boy who had scratched marks on a wall and asked the wall for a favor, and the feeling did not come. Instead, the cupboard felt, for the first time in the long catalogue of nights he had lain in it, like his, not a place he was put, a place he kept. He had drawn a line the unwelcome could not cross, and named the enemy narrow, and given the ward an anchor and a secret name, and it lived now in a bent iron nail in the wall, and it would come when he called it. He found out that it worked the next morning, and he found it out in the best way, which was by doing nothing at all. He overslept. He never overslept. Oversleeping was a thing that cost him breakfast and worse, and his body had trained itself over years to wake before the alarm and be at the stove before Aunt Petunia. But the 11 nights had worn him to the bone, and on the 12th morning he slept past the alarm, past Uncle Vernon's feet, past the pipes, deep and dreamless in the mendied dark of the cupboard, and he woke with the light already high behind the door slats and his heart going hard because he knew what oversleeping cost. He waited for the fist on the door, Aunt Petunia's fist, or her nails, or her voice like a wire. It did not come. He heard her in the kitchen. He heard the radio and the toaster and Dudley whining for something. He heard her cross the hall twice, her feet passing within a yard of the cupboard door, and both times he braced for the wrench of it opening and the arm reaching in, and both times her feet went past and slowed, and a small silence came where the reaching should have been, and then her feet went on, and he heard her say to Uncle Vernon in a voice with a crease in it, that she was sure she'd meant to do something and couldn't for the life of her think what. The ward held. The reaching hand came and met the line it could not cross and turned aside and forgot it had been reaching. Harry lay in the dark on the far side of a threshold. He had built himself out of a grammar 1,000 years old, and he listened to a woman who had woken him with her nails every morning of his rememberable life walk past his door and forget he was behind it, and he did not smile, because there was no one to see him smile, and a smile spent alone is a smile wasted, but something in his chest that had been clenched since before he had words for it let go, half a turn. Way a screw backs off when you finally find the right head for it. He had made a thing that kept him. Nobody had ever kept him. He had made the keeping himself out of the dark, and it worked. He came out when he chose to an hour later and made himself toast, and Aunt Petunia looked at him and could not remember whether she had already set him a chore and set him one at random, and it was the garden again, which suited him because the garden was near the shed. He was careful after that. He was careful in a new way, one that was less about hiding and more about hiding well, and the difference was the difference between a boy who ducks and a boy who has built a wall to duck behind. He did not ward everything. Helga warned against it on the 9th page in letters that woke reluctant and gray, as though she disliked writing the warning and knew she must. The greatest danger to a young warder is not the enemy. It is the warder's own delight. Thou wilt make a thing that works, and it will be the sweetest thing thou hast ever done, and thou wilt want to make 10 more before the sun is up. Do not. Every ward thou makest is a mark upon the world, and the world has eyes thou canst not see, and some of them are old, and some of them are hungry, and all of them will feel a keeping made in the old grammar as a spider feels a fly in the far corner of the web. Make little, make only what thou needest, and when thou hast made it, be still. There was more on that page, and it was the first history Helga ever gave him, and it woke slow and gray under his thumb like a thing dragged up from deep water. The makers did not merely forget us, she wrote. In the last of the old days, when the wandwork was young and boastful and hungry for room, they put us down. A warder builds nothing you can sell and shows nothing you can gasp at. A warder's whole art is that when it works, nothing happens, no army comes, no plague arrives, no child dies, and men do not thank a morning that is only quiet. So the makers called us dull and then old-fashioned, and then, when there were few enough of us left to say it safely dangerous, and they burned the ward books for the safety of all, and salted the histories, and taught their children that magic was a wand in the hand and a word in the mouth and nothing older or deeper beneath. I saw the last great ward hall pulled down stone by men who did not know what the stones were for. I carried out what I could carry. I buried the rest in boxes like the one thou holdest, under stones like the one thou liftedst, against the day the world remembered it had forgotten something. Thou art that day, or thou art nothing, and I do not think thou art nothing. Harry read that 3 times, and the shed was cold, and the moon had gone behind the roof of the house, and he sat with the torch hooded in his hand, and understood that he was not learning a hobby. He was carrying something out of a burning building 1,000 years after the fire. It was too big a thought for a boy of 7, and he held it anyway, carefully, as he held the box, and then he put it in the ledger and closed the lid on it, because a thought that big, left out in the open, would keep him from his chores, and a boy who missed his chores got noticed, and getting noticed was the one thing the whole craft existed to prevent. Harry read the warning about delight and did not fully understand it, and believed it anyway, because he had learned to believe Helga even when he did not understand her, and the believing had never once failed him. He made the hush again better this time, with the grammar behind it, and set it on himself for the walk to Mrs. Figg's. He was sent to Mrs. Figg's on the days the Dursleys went out and did not want him along, which was most days they went anywhere pleasant. Mrs. Figg lived across the road and 2 doors down in a house that smelled of boiled cabbage and cat, and she kept cats, more of them than seemed reasonable, and she made Harry look at photographs of the cats, hundreds of photographs, while she told him their names and their ailments and the names of their forebears, and it was the dullest afternoon a boy could be sentenced to, and Harry had always assumed she disliked him as much as everyone did and kept him out of duty and cabbage. He was less sure now. Because now he was watching, the book had made him a watcher. That was a thing it did without meaning to, a thing that came free with the grammar. Once you have learned to think of the world as sentences with 4 parts, you begin to read the sentences other people are speaking without knowing they speak them, and Harry, sitting in Mrs. Figg's parlor with a plate of stale ginger biscuits and a cat on his feet, began to read Mrs. Figg. She watched him. She watched him as he had learned to watch the Dursleys, sidelong checking, a watching disguised as not watching, and when she thought he was absorbed in a photograph of a tabby named Mr. Tibbles, her eyes went to the window, to number 4 and to him, and back in a small round of duty that never quite stopped. And the cats. The cats watched him too, and the cats did not blink when a cat should blink, and one of them, a heavy gray tom with a squashed face, sat in the window facing number 4 all afternoon and did not once look at the birds. Harry set the hush on himself, quietly under the table, drawn on the inside of his wrist with a wetted finger where the biscuit crumbs would hide the mark. He did not do it to escape, he did it to test. He wanted to know whether Mrs. Figg's watching was the ordinary watching of a cross old woman or the other kind, the seeking kind, the kind the hush could turn. He said it and he meant it, looked past, nothing here, and he watched her eyes. Her eyes slid off him. For most of a minute they slid, and she frowned at the window, and the gray tom in the sill turned its squashed face from number 4 and looked, for the first time all afternoon, at a bird. And then Mrs. Figg blinked and shook herself, and her eyes came back to him with a snap and fixed and stayed, and there was something in them that had not been there before, something awake, and she said, in a voice gone suddenly careful, "You're very quiet today, Harry. Are you feeling quite well?" He wiped the crumb-hidden mark on his trouser leg and gave her the face he gave everyone, the blank obedient nothing face, and said, "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Figg," and she watched him the rest of the afternoon with her cabbage-smelling attention turned up high, and did not offer him more biscuits, and when the Dursleys' car came back she stood at the window and watched him cross the road, all the way to the door, and Harry felt her watching the whole way and did not turn round. He understood 2 things from that afternoon, and he put them in the ledger. The first was that Mrs. Figg was not an ordinary cross old woman. The hush had turned her watching, which meant her watching was the seeking kind, which meant somebody had set her to seek him, and a boy is not set to be sought by cabbage. The second was worse, and he turned it over for 3 nights before he was sure of it. The hush had turned her watching, and then it had failed. Not faded, failed all at once with a snap, the snap of someone who had felt the turning and pushed through it. An ordinary eye did not push through the hush. An ordinary eye slid off and forgot. Mrs. Figg had slid off and then noticed the sliding and come back, which meant she knew, somewhere in her, what the sliding was. Which meant she had felt a keeping made in the old grammar, and known it for what it was, or nearly, and it had put a tightness in her, because the careful voice had carried a tightness Harry knew from the inside, having made so many careful voices himself. Helga had written that the world had eyes he could not see, and some of them were old. Mrs. Figg's gray tom in the window was not, Harry thought, an eye he could not see. It was an eye he could see perfectly well, sitting in a sill facing his house, not looking at birds. But it was an eye that reported to something, and the something was old, or served the old, and the mark he had made on the world had been felt, exactly as she had promised, in the far corner of a web he could not see the edges of. That week the cats multiplied. He counted them because he counted everything: 4 on the Monday, sunning on Mrs. Fig's wall, 6 by the Thursday, and one he did not know, a lean marmalade thing with a torn ear that sat on the fence between the gardens and watched the shed, not the house, the shed, having narrowed the search by half. He did not go to the box for 2 nights running, and on the third he went only to sit beside it in the dark without opening it, so the mark of the opening would not be made, and he found that he could bear not opening it, but only just the way you can bear not scratching an itch if you press your nail into your palm instead. He learned that week that a secret is a kind of ward too, and that it has the same 4 parts, and that the anchor of a secret is the silence you keep, and that the standing against is your own tongue, which wants, more than any enemy, to tell. He made littler after that. He made almost nothing for the rest of the week. He only read, going through the book in order, learning the grammar deeper without writing it into the world, because Helga had said be still and Mrs. Fig's snap had taught him why. And it was in that stillness, reading and not making, that he came to the page that showed him, for the first time, the size of the thing he had found. Far to the north, in a round stone office at the top of a tower, a very old wizard sat among his instruments and did not sleep. He rarely slept in these years. Sleep had become a thing he visited rather than a place he lived, and he did his best thinking in the hours the rest of the castle lay dreaming, among the whir and tick and soft silver breathing of the devices he had built and collected and inherited across a life longer than most men could imagine wanting. One of them stood on a spindle-legged table by the window, a delicate thing of silver wire and smoked glass, and it had been made long ago to watch a single house in Surrey, and to tell him in its wordless way that the protection he had laid upon that house still held. For 6 years it had breathed the same slow, even breath in and out, the breath of a ward at rest, and he had come to trust it as a man trusts the beating of his own heart, which is to say by not thinking of it at all. Tonight it breathed differently, not broken, not alarmed, but the rhythm had a second rhythm inside it now, a fainter pulse folded into the first, and when he bent his long nose to the smoked glass and watched, he saw the silver wire tremble in a pattern he had not built into it and did not recognize. He watched it for a long time. Fox stirred on the perch and settled. Old Wizard's face in the light of the instruments gave away nothing, because it had been trained across 100 years to give away nothing, and what moved behind it moved slowly and left no track on the surface. He considered the possibility that the ward was settling further into itself, deepening with the years as blood magic sometimes did, and he found the explanation reasonable and did not believe it, because he had not lived so long by believing the reasonable explanations he offered himself. He considered other possibilities. He set them in a row in his mind as another man might set out chess pieces, and he looked at them, and he did not move any of them yet. The boy would be 7 now, he thought. 7 and safe behind his mother's blood and unremarkable, which was the whole of what had been asked of Surrey and the whole of what he had wanted for the child, or told himself he wanted, in the part of the long machinery of his planning where want and need had been welded together so many years ago that he could no longer find the seam. 7 was young. 7 was too young for anything to have begun. And yet the instrument breathed its second breath, faint and patient and new, and he stood at the window with his terrible attention gathering behind his half-moon spectacles, and he decided without appearing to decide to have Arabella write to him more often. He would not go himself, not yet. Going himself would be a move on the board, and a move announces itself, and there was nothing yet that wanted announcing. He would watch. He was very good at watching, better than any living thing except perhaps the phoenix, and he had the patience of a man who had already outlived everyone he had ever needed to outlive. Whatever had woken in the little house in Surrey, he would watch it and weigh it, and when the time came he would name it, and he had never yet in his long life failed to name a thing before it could name him. In the shed in Surrey that same night, Harry read the passage that showed him the size of it. It was on the 20th page, and the ink woke gold instead of black, the only gold in the whole book, and Harry breathed on it and pressed it up and read by torchlight the thing Helga had set down in gold because, she wrote, some things must be written in the metal that does not tarnish, so that the last reader may know they were meant. And what she had written was this: Thou hast learned the little keepings, and thou thinkest them large, because thou art small, and that is right, and I was the same. But know what they are the smallest end of. The first wizards, the ones before me, the ones whose grammar I gathered up off the floor of the world after the makers had swept it aside, did not ward marmalade in cupboards. They warded a valley so that no army might march into it, and the army came, and marched 3 days along the ridge, and turned aside, and never knew a valley was there. They warded a well against poison so that the plague that took the low country passed the high village by, and the villagers thought themselves lucky, and it was not luck, it was a keeping made in this grammar by a warder whose name is gone. They warded a child in a cradle so that death itself, coming for it, found the cradle empty to its reaching and full to every friendly eye, and death went away hungry, and the child grew and never knew. This is the grammar in thy hands, it is the same grammar. A cupboard and a valley are the same sentence writ small and writ large, and the only difference between the warder who keeps a cupboard and the warder who turns an army is practice, and patience, and years, and thou hast years, for thou art 7, and I have given thee a start no living wizard has had in longer than the school has stood. Harry read it, and he set the torch down, and he sat in the dark of the shed with the gold words fading back into the page, and he understood all at once and for the first time that the thing in his hands was not a trick for turning aside marmalade. It was the smallest end of a magic that had turned armies. He had thought he was learning to hide. He was learning to keep, and keeping, done large enough, could hide a valley from a war. He was 7 years old. He looked at his own hands in the dark, the hands that had put blood into a bent iron nail and made a cupboard his, and he tried to imagine those hands turning an army, and he could not because he was 7, and the failing to imagine it was the most important thing that happened to him that night, because it meant he knew already in the careful bones of him that he was at the beginning of something and not the end. There were years between the cupboard and the valley. He had the years. And out beyond the shed and the garden and the sleeping street, in a house that smelled of cabbage, a gray Tom sat in a window not looking at birds, and far to the north a silver instrument breathed its new second breath, and Harry knew neither of them was empty of meaning, and he obeyed Helga's warning, and he made Littler, and he read, and he waited, and the grammar deepened in him like water going down into dry ground, patient and coming in the end to the root. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Anchors. By the time the leaves came down, Harry knew the difference between keeping a thing and keeping a place, and he had begun to circle the hardest keeping of all, which was keeping a name. He was still 7. He counted that too because the number mattered to Helga, and so it had come to matter to him. 7 years old and 8 months into a craft the modern world had spent 1,000 years forgetting, and the gap between what he could do and what a boy his age was supposed to do had become a private joke he told himself on the bad days. A 7-year-old was meant to be learning his times tables. Harry had his times tables. He also had a book that woke to his blood, a cupboard no unwelcome hand could open, and a pair of glasses mended with a keeping instead of tape, and he wore all of it quietly, under the ordinary gray coat of a boy nobody looked at twice, which was exactly how Helga had taught him to wear it. Autumn was good for the craft, because autumn gave him the dark early. The clocks went back and the Dursleys drew their curtains at 5, and by 6 the garden was a country of shadows that belonged to him, and he could be at the shed and into the box while the television was still shouting its evening shows through the wall. He read faster now. The Old English had stopped being a wall and become a door. He no longer had to sound the words out. He heard Helga's voice in them, dry and practical and 1,000 years dead, and he had caught himself more than once answering her under his breath, which he knew was foolish and did anyway, because she was the only teacher he had ever had who wanted him to be more than he was rather than less. The autumn's lesson was anchors, and anchors turned out to be the whole secret of the craft, the reason it had lasted where the wand work had not. A spell, Helga wrote, dies with the wand that casts it, or lives an hour or a day and then is spent like a candle. But a ward anchored true will keep long after the warder is dust. Choose thy anchor, and thou choosest how long thy keeping shall stand. There were 6 anchors worth the name, and Helga gave them to him 1 a week, and made him prove each before she would give the next, and Harry, who had never been trusted to prove anything, proved them with a care that would have troubled a grown wizard, had one been there to see. Stone was the first, and stone was patient. A ward anchored in stone kept as long as the stone kept its shape, which for good stone was longer than kingdoms. Iron was the second, and iron was faithful. Iron remembered, Helga said, as old dogs remember, and would hold a keeping through fire and flood, and would come when its warder called the name from a great way off. Blood was the third, and blood was strong and short and dangerous, for a ward anchored in a living thing burned as brightly as that thing and died with it, and Helga warned him twice on the same page never to anchor in his own blood a keeping he was not willing to die beside. Threshold was the fourth, the anchor of doorways and gates and the lines between one place and another, and it was the anchor of the great old wards, the ones that turned armies, because an army must always, in the end, cross a line to reach the thing it came for, and a warder who owned the line on the war. Hearth was the fifth, the anchor of the fire a family gathers round. And name was the sixth, and name was the deepest and the strangest, and he did not master it for a long time, and the not mastering taught him more than the mastering of the others. He anchored in stone first, because stone was easy to find. There was a flat curbstone at the end of Privet Drive, at the mouth of the alley that ran behind the houses, worn smooth by 40 years of little winging feet, close-grained and cold, and it had stood there longer than Uncle Vernon's marriage, and would stand there longer than Uncle Vernon. Harry chose it for a hush, a wide, gentle turn-away meant to keep a passing grown-up's eye off the alley mouth, so that a boy hurrying home in the dark would not be seen to hurry, and not be stopped and asked whose he was and why he was out. He drew the leaning lines low on the face of the curb, in chalk first to try the placing, then, when the placing proved true, in a paste he made himself from soot off the shed roof and spit and a drop of blood, because Helga had taught him that a mark meant to last must be made of things that last, and chalk was for practice and paste was for keeping. He anchored it and named the anchor and meant it and walked away, and the next evening he watched from the corner as the neighbor from number 7 walked her dog past the alley, and her eyes went to it and slid off and went on, and the dog looked down the alley and whined and would not go in because dogs, Helga had warned, sometimes feel a keeping that men miss. Harry took the note and stored it. The dogs know. Remember the dogs. He anchored an iron next, and iron was where the craft first showed him a tooth, and the biting taught him something he would need before the winter was out. He had found in the back of the shed a horseshoe rusted to lace, nailed above the door by some long-gone believer in luck. Iron. He took it down one night and cleaned it, which took an hour, and he warded it as a portable keeping, a hush he could carry, anchored in the iron so it would not die when his mind wandered, so he could set it going in the morning and forget it and still be turned from all day. It was a clever idea, and it worked, and it nearly undid him, because a keeping you carry and forget is a keeping that is working when you have stopped watching it. First day he carried the warded horseshoe in his coat pocket to school. He became, without meaning to, so thoroughly not there that the dinner lady served the whole line and left his tray empty, not from spite for once, but because her eye had never once found him, and he stood at the end of the counter for a full minute being served past, and then he understood, and he closed his hand around the horseshoe and thought loud and clear, "I am here." And she blinked and said, "Good gracious, where did you spring from?" And gave him his dinner. He learned 3 things from the horseshoe, and he counted them. A carried keeping is always on. A keeping always on is a keeping you forget you are wearing. And a boy who is never seen is a boy who is never fed, never helped, never let in out of the rain, so that the hush overused was not a shield but a slow starving, and the whole art of it was to be unseen when he chose and seen when he chose, and never to let the choosing rust shut. He put the horseshoe away after that and carried it only when he meant to. He respected the craft the more for the biting, because a thing that could hurt you if you were careless was a thing worth being careful with, and careful was the one thing Harry had always known how to be. Then Helga gave him the passage about the Iron Singers, and the world he lived in got larger by a nation. It was on the 29th page, and the ink was black going to green, and it came up slow. "Thou wilt wonder how iron came to remember," she wrote, "for it does not remember of itself. A bar of iron is a dull and honest thing. It remembers because it was taught long ago by the ones who first sang the ore out of the hills and hammered it into a shape that would hold a keeping. We did not teach iron, they did. The goblins, the iron singers, the oldest smiths who were warders before we were warders, who anchored their halls so deep that no wizard has ever taken one and held it, though many have tried and all have died trying. Mark this and mark it well, for it is the one piece of my craft I did not make and cannot fully give thee. The deepest keeping in the world is not mine and was never a wizard's, it is theirs. If ever thou art in true need, greater need than a book can meet, and if ever thou canst reach them, go to the iron singers under their hill, and show them thou knowest the old grammar, and speak to them not as a wizard speaks to a goblin, which is as a master to a tool, but as a warder speaks to a warder, which is as one keeper to another. And they may, though I do not promise it, for they promise nothing, they may open a door to thee that has been shut to my whole kind since the falling out. I went to them once, I will not write what passed, but I came away knowing that the last and greatest wardcraft in the world sleeps under a hill in the north, in the keeping of a people the makers taught their children to despise, and that is the bitterest joke the world has played on the warders, and I have laughed at it alone more than once. Harry read that many times. He understood the shape of it, which was that there were people in the world who could do what he was learning to do, and more and better and older, and that they were not gone, not dust like Helga, but alive under a hill in the north, keeping a door. He had thought he was the last of something. He was not the last, he was the newest of something very old, and somewhere the eldest of it were still awake, and one day in true need he might go to them and be known. He put the word Iron Singers in the ledger in its own compartment, next to the word North, and he took the warded horseshoe out that night and held it and thought about the hands that had first taught iron to remember, and the horseshoe was warm in his palm, and he could not tell whether that was the keeping or his own blood, and he decided it did not matter which. It was the first time he had held a made thing and felt through it the whole reach of years back to the hands that had made the making possible, and it was too large a feeling for a shed, and he put it away with the horseshoe. Hearth was the anchor he could not lay, because Harry had no hearth, and the discovering of why that mattered was a lesson in itself. Helga wrote of the hearth as she wrote of nothing else, warmly, at length, in ink that woke a deep, steady red. The hearth is the anchor of the home, she wrote, and the home is the first ward any people ever built, before the valley and before the well, for a home is only a fire with a keeping round it, a line drawn in the dark that says, "Inside this we are warm and we are together, and what is out there does not come in." Anchor a keeping in a true hearth, and it will hold as long as the fire is fed and the family gathers, and it will be gentle where the stone is stern and the iron is cold, for it is made of the same stuff as the thing it guards, which is love, though I am an old woman and mislike the word. Harry read that in a shed with no fire in it, hooded torch in his cupped hand, and found he did not understand it, and understood that he did not understand it, and that the failing was not in the reading. He had no fire that was his. The gas fire in the Dursleys' front room was switched off when he entered a room and switched on when he left it. The kitchen stove was a place he cooked for others and ate cold scraps beside. There was no line in the whole house that said inside this we are together, unless it was the line of the cupboard door, and the cupboard had no fire, so he built one. He took a clean tin that had held golden syrup and set in it a stub of candle rescued from the kitchen drawer, and he lit it in the shed one still night, and he sat before it with his knees drawn up as a family draws round a fire, one boy where a family should be, and he tried to anchor a keeping in the little flame. It would not take, the letters lay dead on the tin. He tried 3 nights running, and the hearth anchor refused him every time, and on the 3rd night he understood why, and the understanding sat in his chest and would not be filed. The hearth would not anchor because a hearth is a fire a family gathers round, and Harry gathered round his candle alone, and a warder cannot lie to the grammar. He could not build the anchor of togetherness out of a boy who had never been together with anyone. He blew the candle out and put the tin away and did not try the hearth again that autumn, and he told himself it was because Helga had ranked it 5th and he would come to it in its turn, and that was true, and it was not the whole of the truth, and he knew it, and he worked. Name was worse and better, and he circled it all November. Helga wrote about it carefully, in the tone of a woman handing a child a knife. A name is the strongest anchor of the 6 and the last thou shouldst attempt, for a ward anchored in a name lives as long as the name is spoken and true, and dies the moment the name is forgotten or forsworn, and it binds the keeping not to a stone thou canst leave, nor an iron thou canst pocket, but to the sound that means thee, which thou canst never set down. To anchor in thy name is to say, this keeping is me, and I am this keeping, and we stand or fall as one. It is how the first wizards warded kings and cradles and themselves when there was nothing else left to stand on. Do it wrong and thou hast tied a ward to a lie, and it will fail thee, or worse, it will hold, and thou wilt spend thy life defending a name that is not thine. Harry sat with that a long time in the cold shed, because it went somewhere in him the other anchors had not. He knew what it was to have a name that did not feel like his. Boy Aunt Petunia called him mostly, and worse when she forgot herself, and the Potter boy the neighbors called him, in the tone of a thing they had been warned about, and Harry only the teachers used, indifferently, off a register. He had never once heard his name said as a kindness and not a warning. And Helga was telling him his name could be the deepest anchor in the world, the thing a great ward stood on, and Harry looked at that and understood, with the flat clarity the craft had given him, that he did not know his own name well enough to anchor a keeping in it. He knew who the boy in the cupboard was. He did not know who Harry Potter was. Those were not, he suspected, the same person, and until he knew which one he was, the name anchor would take no keeping from him, because a ward anchored in a name is a ward anchored in an answer to the question, who art thou? And Harry at 7 did not have the answer. So he left the name anchor alone and was not ashamed of leaving it, because Helga had said it should be the last, and he trusted her ordering of things. But he took the question away with him, who art thou, and it sat in the ledger and would not be filed, and on the bad nights he took it out and looked at it, and understood that somewhere at the end of the craft, past all the little keepings, there was a keeping he could not make until he had become someone worth keeping, and that this, and not the wand kind and not the owls, was the true work. The watchers changed that autumn, and Harry noticed, because noticing was the first thing the craft had made him good at. Mrs. Fig's cats were still there, the grey Tom and the marmalade one with the torn ear and a rotation of others, and they had become a kind of weather, a low steady surveillance he had learned to live under as you live under a grey sky. But in October a second watching arrived, and it was not cats, it was owls. Owls in daylight, which Harry knew even at 7 was wrong, sitting in the bare branches of the sycamore at the end of the road at noon, 1 and then 2 and then, one still white morning, 3, turning their flat faces to number 4 and blinking their slow, enormous blinks. And once, at dusk, a man. A man Harry had never seen, in a long coat too heavy for the season, standing at the mouth of the warded alley, standing at it and not in it, because the curb hush turned him at the threshold, and looking at the house with a stillness no ordinary man on an ordinary street ever had, the stillness of a person who has been sent to look and is looking. Harry watched him from the cupboard's air vent, one eye to the slat, and the man stood for 11 minutes by Harry's count and then turned and walked away, and where he walked the streetlight seemed reluctant to fall on him, and Harry thought, with the flat certainty the craft had given him, that is one of the wand kind, and he has come to see, and he is not the last that will come. He hunted the pages that night for anything about being watched by the wand kind, and Helga, who had died 1,000 years before owls sat in Surrey sycamores, had nevertheless written the thing he needed, because she had been watched too in her day by the makers who feared her. When they come to look, she wrote, do not hide harder. A boy who hides harder is a boy who has something to hide, and they will dig for it, hide easier, be duller, be exactly the boy they expect and a little less. Let the hush do the hiding deep and quiet, while thou on the surface art the plainest bread in England. The greatest ward is a boring life, worn on top of a secret one. Harry read that and looked at the grey coat and the empty tray and the cupboard and the chores, at the whole punishment the Dursleys had built for him, and he understood that they had handed him, meaning it as a cruelty, the perfect disguise, and he laughed once, without any sound, alone in the dark, and thought he understood Helga a little better for it. The pressure came in November, and it came from the direction he had stopped watching, which is the direction it always comes from. He had grown so used to warding against the wand kind and the cats and the owls and the still man in the heavy coat that he had let the ordinary dangers of his ordinary life slip down his list, and the most ordinary danger in Harry's life had a name, and the name was Dudley, and the game was Harry hunting. It went like this. Dudley had a gang, 4 of them, big soft boys who had learned from Dudley that the world was a thing you took from smaller people, and on the afternoons when there was nothing on the television and nothing else to break, they hunted Harry, 5 of them after one of him, through the park and the alleys and the little wood behind the leisure center, and if they caught him they did to him what boys do who have never once been told no. Harry's whole strategy for years had been to be faster, and to know the ground better and to reach home, the one door in the world Dudley would not follow him through, because Aunt Petunia did not like grass on her floor. That November afternoon they caught him in the wood, and it went wrong from the first second, because there were not 4 boys with Dudley. There were 5, and the 5th was new, a cousin of Piers's, 15 and heavy and mean in a colder way than the little ones, a boy who did not hunt Harry for the fun of it as Dudley did but for the practice, and he had brought a length of the orange plastic fencing they used on the roadworks torn off in a strip. Harry saw the strip in the big cousin's hands and understood with the flat certainty that this was not the usual game. They meant to catch him and hold him. They had never held him. Held changed everything. He ran. He was fast and he knew the wood, and he went for the gap in the leisure center fence that only a small boy could take, and the big cousin who had scouted it was there before him, filling the gap, grinning, and Harry checked and turned, and the 4 little ones were spreading behind him in a half ring, herding him toward the drainage ditch at the back where the ground fell away and there was nowhere to go. He understood in the space of 2 heartbeats that his old strategy, be faster, had failed, because for the first time the ground was theirs and not his, and the door he always ran for was half a mile off across open park, and they stood between him and it. So he stopped running, and he did the other thing, and it was the first time in his life he had used the craft to defend his body instead of his cupboard, and he found out in that ditch what 8 months of nights in a shed had actually bought him. He had in his coat the warded horseshoe, and in his pockets a stub of the soutane spit paste and a screw of greaseproof paper, and in his head the whole grammar, and he had, more than any of it, the thing Helga said could not be written down, which was that he meant it. He backed to the lip of the ditch as a boy backs who is beaten and cornered, which he was, and he let his shoulders drop and his face go to the blank obedient nothing, and while the 5 of them closed in slow and enjoying it, calling the things they called, he was crouching, one hand in the mud of the ditch lip, drawing. He drew a threshold, not around himself, which is what a cornered boy would do, and which would only have marked him as the prize. He drew it across the neck of the little clearing, along the line the 5 of them would have to cross to reach him, low in the mud where their eyes were too high and too sure to look. 3 quick sweeps of the paste stub and a 4th of his own bloody thumb for the anchor, blood because blood was quick and he did not need this to last past sundown, only to last 10 seconds, and he named the enemy narrow and true and without a scrap of mercy. Because Helga had taught him that mercy in the standing against was weakness in the ward, the ones who come to hurt me here now, do not let them cross. And he meant it with everything he had, every empty tray and every torn shirt and every morning of running poured into 3 lines of soot in the mud. This is the line, they do not cross it, and the big cousin, grinning, stepped over it first, and stopped. He stopped as a man stops who has walked into a glass door he did not see, his whole heavy body arriving at a place his front foot had already left, and the grin came off his face and something else came onto it, a puzzlement going quickly to something worse, and he lifted his foot to step again and set it down again in the same place, as though the ground on the far side of the line had turned to a stair that was not there, and he said in a voice gone thin what and did not finish. Because the little ones were piling into his back and they hit the line too, Harry crouched at the bottom of the ditch and watched 5 boys who wanted to hurt him fail, one after another, to walk 4 feet of ordinary English mud. They did not understand it, and so they could not fight it. The threshold did not throw them or burn them or do any of the loud things the wand kind would have done. It simply, quietly, patiently was not to be crossed by anyone who crossed it meaning him harm, and their harm was the key that turned the lock against them, so that the harder they wanted through, the more solidly the not crossing stood. Dudley, who had known Harry all his life and had a low animal sense for the moments when Harry became strange, went white and grabbed the big cousin's sleeve and said, "Leave it, leave him, let's go," in the voice he kept for the times the strangeness was on his cousin and even his stupid courage failed. And the big cousin, who had no such sense and only a mounting need to be through, put his shoulder down and drove at the line with the whole 15 years of his weight, and the line held, and he went down in the mud on his own side of it as a man goes down who has run headlong into a wall his hands cannot find. And he lay there in the leaf mold making a sound Harry had made himself, on other afternoons, at the bottom of other ditches. It was that sound more than the winning that Harry kept afterward, because it was the sound of someone learning that the world could stop them, and Harry had not known, until he heard it come out of someone else, how much he had wanted the world to make that sound on his behalf. They left. Dudley dragged them, gabbling, and the big cousin went last, walking backwards, staring at the empty clearing where a small boy crouched in a ditch and did nothing at all. And Harry waited until the wood was quiet and the birds came back before he stood up, and his legs were shaking, and he let them shake, and he looked at the 3 lines of soot in the mud, already blurring as the anchor blood dried and the keeping loosened, and there rose in him the one thing he let himself name that whole gray autumn, which was fear. Not of the boys, that was finished. Fear of himself, of the flat cold ease with which he had poured his whole hurt into a line and made 5 people fail to cross it, of how little it had cost him and how much it had given back. He scuffed the lines out with his heel until no trace remained. He walked home the long way, past the warded alley, and let the curb hush take him, and was not seen, and wanted nothing else in the world just then but not to be seen, and understood that the wanting and the naming were 2 faces of one coin he would be turning over for the rest of his life. The cousin never came back, and the story he told that the Potter boy had done something, made the ground go wrong, made them all fall over, was exactly the kind of story a big boy tells to explain a beating he did not deliver, and no grown-up believed a word of it. That, Harry thought, was the second half of Helga's lesson about the boring life. The keeping in the old grammar was not only hard to see, it was hard to believe even when described, because it did nothing a modern person had a word for. The cousin had walked into a wall that was not there. Try telling a schoolteacher that. The craft protected itself in the end by being unbelievable, and Harry, who had spent his whole life not being believed, found in that a companionship he had not expected. The story reached Uncle Vernon third hand, though, and Uncle Vernon did not need to believe a thing to be enraged by it. He came home that Friday with the neighborhood already muttering, the owls in the sycamore having been noticed by more eyes than Harry's, and someone at the golf club having said the Dursleys' nephew was an odd one, always had been, and there was talk. Vernon did not need to believe a word of it to be set roaring by it. Talk was the one weapon that reached him, because talk was aimed at the great soft thing he cared about more than his own comfort, which was seeming normal, and he came through the door with his face the color of corned beef and his eye already on the cupboard. Harry heard the car and heard the door and heard the tread coming, heavy and fast and wrong, and he went into the cupboard and pulled the door to and put his back against the mattress and his hand flat on the wall beside the bent iron nail, and he called the ward by its secret name. 3 syllables no living soul had ever heard, and he felt it wake under his palm like a dog lifting its head. The handle turned and did not open. Vernon rattled it and it did not open, and he put his shoulder to it, all 18 stone, and the thin cupboard door that a child could have kicked through stood in its frame like a slab cut from the same stone as the curb at the end of the road. And Vernon bounced off it and stood in the hall breathing like a train and roared at it, come out, and the door did not open because the reaching hand had come, meaning harm, and met the line it could not cross, and no reaching hand, however it burns, crosses a threshold named against it. Harry sat on the far side of an inch of wood in 1,000 years of grammar and listened to a grown man fail to open a door that had no lock, and he did not gloat, and he did not tremble, and he understood, sitting there, that the cupboard he had been given as a punishment had become, by his own hand, the safest room in England, and that this was the strangest revenge a boy could take to make of his prison a keep. Vernon told Petunia the door was swollen with the damp and must be seen to, because a man must tell himself something, and Harry let him have the door back an hour later, opening it himself meekly to a house that had spent itself on an inch of pine. And he ate the cold supper he was given and said thank you and washed the plates, the plainest bread in England, and inside the ledger the keeping hummed, fed now, grown, no longer only a cupboard's threshold but a thing that had turned a man. But someone had believed the cousin's story after all, or rather, someone had felt what the cousin could only badly describe. Harry knew it that night, because the owls came to the sycamore in the dark, which owls do, but they came in a number that was not weather, 5 of them, 6, turning their faces not to the house now but toward the wood, the leisure center, the exact patch of Surrey where a 7-year-old had that afternoon anchored a threshold in blood and turned 5 attackers at a line. Harry lay in his warded cupboard and listened to them arrive, one soft wing beat after another out of the dark, and he understood that he had made, that afternoon, a mark on the world too large to hide, a keeping born of real need and meant with his whole self, and that the far corners of the web he could not see had all felt it at once. He had broken Helga's first rule. He had made large and made it in the open, and now they were coming to see who had done it, and he was 7, and he had nothing between himself and them but a grammar out of a buried book in the disguise of a boring life, and for the first time he was not certain the disguise would be enough. Far to the north, the silver instrument on the spindle-legged table stopped breathing its slow, even breath and rang. It was not a loud sound. It was a single clear note, like a struck glass, and it hung in the round stone office and did not fade as a struck glass should, and the very old wizard, who had been reading a letter from Arabella that said the boy was quiet, too quiet, and that she had felt something in the parlor a fortnight back that she had not felt since the war and did not like, set the letter down and looked at the instrument. The smoked glass had gone from gray to a color he had no name for, and the silver wire had drawn itself into a shape he did recognize now, at last, after weeks of not recognizing it, because he had seen it once, a very long time ago, in a book that was supposed to have been burned, a shape the old texts called the warder's line. He sat in his tower with a phoenix asleep on its perch and understood, with the part of him that had never in a long and terrible life been wrong about the important things, that the protection on the house in Surrey was no longer the only protection on the house in Surrey. Something else had woken there, something older than his craft, older than the school, older than the line of instruments on his table, and it was living in a child of 7. He did not go that night. He was too old, too careful, and too guilty to go that night, and he knew all 3 things about himself and forgave himself none of them. He took a fresh sheet of paper and wrote, in his slanting hand, a list, and the list had names on it, some of them people and some of them books, and one of them a hill in the north he had not let himself think about in 50 years, and at the bottom he wrote a single word and underlined it twice, and the word was watch. Then he sat a long time in the ringing quiet and did not sleep, which was nothing new, and turned over in his mind the child he had left on a doorstep with a letter and a promise, and how a doorstep and a letter had been, he had told himself, protection and love enough, and how the instrument's new note was telling him, in a voice he could not answer, that the child had gone and found protection somewhere his careful planning had never once thought to look. In the cupboard in Surrey, Harry turned to the box's last read page and asked it, in the only way he had, what he was to do now that he had been felt. The ink woke, and it was not an answer to the question he had asked, because Helga could not hear his questions, only leave, 1,000 years early, the answers she had guessed he would need. But it was near enough to feel like an answer, and it was this: when they have felt thee, and thou knowest they have felt thee, then the time of little keepings is over, and thou must choose. Thou canst put the book back in the ground and be a boy and forget, and let the world forget thee, and there is no shame in it, and it is what I would tell my own child to do. Or thou canst learn the last thing I have to teach, the thing all the little keepings were only the alphabet of, the keeping the first wizards made when the world itself came hunting, the great ward, the wall, the founder's work, that turns not a boy's 5 bullies but a thing that means to end thee. It is a year's work at the least, and it is dangerous, and it cannot be unmade once begun, and I will not tell thee to attempt it. I will tell thee only that I built one once, and that I am writing to thee now because it worked, and that everything I was able to bury for thee to find was buried behind it, and kept safe by it, for 1,000 years, which is the only reason thou hast a book to read at all. Harry read it twice and then closed the box, and did not decide that night, because he was 7 and it was late, and a boy who has turned 5 attackers at a line, and a grown man at a door is a boy who needs, before anything, to sleep. But he lay in the dark with the answer in the ledger, and turned the coin over and over, and thought about the still man in the heavy coat, and the owls, and the door under the hill in the north, and a wall the first wizards had built when the world itself came hunting, and understood that the little keepings were finished, that he had crossed a line as surely as the big cousin had failed to, and that whatever he chose, the choosing was in some sense he did not have the years to name already made. He was going to learn the great ward. He had known it, he thought, since the sound the cousin made in the leaf mold. He was only waiting for the morning to be brave enough to say it to himself in daylight. Outside, the owls sat in the sycamore and did not sleep, and across the road a gray tom sat in a window and did not sleep, and far to the north an old man sat in a tower and did not sleep, and in a cupboard under 14 stairs a 7-year-old warder lay in a keeping he had built with his own blood, and alone of all the watchers on that long cold night, slept, deep and dreamless, because he had made a thing that kept him, and it was working. And he had learned at last to trust it enough to close his eyes. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. The Iron Singers. The Great Ward was a year's work, Helga had warned, and Harry, who had never been given a year of anything, began it in the first week of December, on his knees in the frost. He began as she told him to begin, which was not with a letter or an anchor, but with a walk. Before thou drawest a single mark, she wrote, thou must know the ground. The Great Ward is a wall, and a wall must have a line to stand on, and the line is not thine to choose. It is the ground's, and thou must find it. Walk thy keeping's edge 100 times. Learn where the water runs, and where the old stones lie, and where a thing might come in that thou hast not thought of. A warder who draws his wall before he knows his ground builds a fence with a gate in it he cannot see. So Harry walked. He walked the edge of number 4's plot in the grey mornings before the house woke, along the back fence and the side returns and the front hedge and the mean strip of pavement, 100 times and then 100 more, until he knew the boundary of the Dursleys' land as he knew the 14 stairs, every dip and root and drain of it, and he found the thing Helga had promised he would find, which was that the true line of the keeping was not the fence at all. The fence was where the Dursleys thought their land stopped. The true line, the old line, ran 3 feet inside it, along a course of dark flat stones half sunk in the soil that no one living had laid that had been there. Harry understood with a flat certainty, since before the house, since before the road, part of some older keeping whose warder was 1,000 years' dust. He had found, running under the ordinary boundary of an ordinary house, the buried bones of a line that had once been meant to hold. Before he laid a single mark, though, he made Helga tell him what a great ward was, and what she told him was the largest thing he had ever tried to hold in his head, and he held it anyway, piece at a time, because holding large things a piece at a time was the only skill he had ever truly owned. A great ward, she wrote, in ink that woke a deep smoked blue he had not seen before, is not a big or small ward. Do not think it so, or thou wilt fail, and thy failing may cost thee thy life. A small ward is a sentence. A great ward is a book, many sentences, bound in an order, each keeping the next, so that the whole stands where no single sentence could. The first wizards built them in rings, one within another, like the rings of a felled tree, and each ring did one work only and did it wholly, and the rings together did what no ring alone could dream of. The outermost ring is the turning ring, and it is a hush grown vast, and its work is that the enemy never comes at all, for what he cannot find he cannot strike. The greatest keeping is the one that is never tested, and a great ward's first mercy is to end the battle before it begins by hiding the field. Within the turning ring lies the crossing ring, the threshold grown vast, and its work is that the enemy who has somehow found the field cannot set foot upon it, cannot cross the line, is turned at the boundary as thy bullies were turned at thy soot in the mud. Within the crossing ring lies the binding ring, and its work is that the enemy who has somehow crossed cannot move, is held, is fixed in the place of his crossing like a fly in amber, so that he may do no harm while thou decidest what is to be done with him. And within the binding ring, at the still center on the keystone, lies the last ring, the unmaking ring, the deepest and most terrible, whose work I will not teach thee until thou hast built the other 3 and proven thou canst be trusted with a thing that eats magic, for that is what the unmaking is. A keeping that does not turn a curse aside nor hold it fast, but takes it apart, unpicks it in the air, unsays the sentence some other wizard spent his hate to speak, and leaves him with nothing in his hand and nothing in his mouth, and the sudden knowledge that he has come to the wrong house. Harry read that 4 times over 4 nights, and each time the size of it settled on him a little heavier, and each time he refused to let the size of it stop him, because Helga had taught him the trick of impossible things, which was that impossible was only a word for a job you had not yet broken into small enough pieces. So he broke it. He took a stub of Dudley's discarded pencil, and on the back of a school worksheet he had hidden inside his mattress, he drew the 4 rings as Helga described them, one within another, and he wrote beside each ring the work it did, and the letters it wanted, and the anchor it would stand on, and he made of the founder's wall a list, and a list was a thing that could not stop Harry, because a list was only chores, and Harry had been doing chores his whole life. Turning ring, a hush on the outer boundary, anchored in the sunken founder stones, standing against any eye that came seeking him by name or by kind. Crossing ring, a threshold 3 feet within, anchored in iron driven at the 4 corners, standing against any foot that crossed meaning him harm. Binding ring, a holdfast in a circle round the house itself, anchored in the walls, standing against any hand that had crossed and still meant harm. And at the center, on the keystone he had not yet found, the unmaking, left blank on his drawing, a box with a question mark in it, because Helga had said not yet, and Harry had learned to trust her not yets. It was, he reckoned, 300 marks at the least, laid in the true materials, each one true or the whole thing false, over a whole turning of the year, in secret, in the dark, in a garden that belonged to people who would have burned the book and beaten the boy had they known 1 hour of what he did. It was the most work he had ever contemplated. It was more work than the whole of his short gray life laid end to end. He looked at his pencil drawing of the 4 rings by torchlight in the shed, and he understood that he was 7 years old, and proposing to spend the whole of his 7th year raising a wall the last wizard to raise had been Helga 1,000 years dead, and instead of the thing a sensible boy would have felt, he felt the clean cold click of a sum that was large but not, in the end, impossible, only long, and long was a thing he had in great supply. Because a boy with nothing to look forward to has more time than anyone alive, the keystone was the one piece he could not supply, and knowing that he could not supply it was itself a lesson. He walked the plot until he found the true center of it, which was not the middle of the lawn as a builder would reckon, but the doorstep, the threshold stone of the front door itself, where the whole traffic of the house crossed in and out, the busiest line in any home and therefore the strongest place to anchor the last and deepest ring. He knelt at the doorstep one gray dawn and laid his palm flat on it and asked it, in the way the craft had taught him to ask, whether it would hold the unmaking, and the stone answered in the way stones answer, that it would hold a keeping but not that one. The unmaking wanted iron, true iron, iron that remembered deeper than any nail a Surrey shed could give him, and Harry had no such iron and knew of none, and could think of no honest way for a boy in a cupboard to come by a metal that did not exist in the ordinary world. He wrote the lack down in the ledger plainly, as he wrote every lack. Keystone wants an iron I do not have. He did not know, kneeling there in the frost, that the iron was already walking toward him along the deep roads of the world, in the coat pocket of a creature 200 years old. He knew only that the wall had a hole in its heart he could not yet fill, and that a warder who pretends he has what he lacks builds a wall that falls, and so he left the keystone bare and built inward toward it, trusting, as Helga had taught him to trust, that the need honestly named has a way of drawing the thing that meets it. He worked out how to hide a year of it, too, because Helga's whole first law was do not be felt, and a great ward, she warned, is the loudest thing a warder ever makes. There's no hiding the raising of it, only the slowing of it, so that it goes up too gradually for any single night to ring. Lay it as the coral lays the reef, she wrote, a grain at a time, so that no one who watches on any one night sees anything worth the watching, and only the years, looking back, see the wall. So Harry made himself a rule, and the rule was 1 mark a night and never 2, however much the wanting clawed at him. And he understood that the wanting was the very danger Helga had named, the young warder's hunger to make, and that the whole discipline of the great work was the daily refusing of it, and he refused it, night after night, 1 mark and then the box shut and the shed dark and the boy back in his cupboard, and he found that the refusing was itself a kind of keeping. A ward he built around his own eagerness, and that building it made him older in a way the marks did not. He tested his materials before he trusted them to the wall, because a warder who learns his materials on the wall learns them too late. He learned which of the sunken founder stones would take a mark and which had gone dead in the centuries, tapping each with a knuckle and listening for the faint answering ring that meant the old keeping still slept in it, and he found 9 of 11 were living, and marked the 2 dead ones in his mind so the wall would step around them. He learned how deep to drive the corner irons so the frost would not heave them by spring, and he practiced the driving on a scrap of the garden the Dursleys never looked at until his hands knew the depth without measuring. He learned most usefully that a mark laid in haste on a cold night was a mark laid wrong, the paste too stiff, the lines too shallow, the meaning it thinned by the cold and the hurry, and that a warder in winter must warm his materials against his own body before he works them. So Harry took to carrying the paste tin under his shirt against his ribs for an hour before each night's mark, and the warmth of his own blood went into the wall through the warmth of the paste, and he thought Helga would have approved. And on the pages that answered him it seemed that she did, so that when the shortest day came and the frost lay thick, and he knelt at the oldest of the living founder stones with a tin of paste warmed against his own ribs and a whole year's plan drawn small in his head, he was not beginning blindly. He was beginning a thing he had already built entire in the ledger behind his eyes, brick by brick, so that the laying of it in the world was only the slow, honest copying out of a design he had proven 100 times in the dark, and that, Helga had written, was the last secret of the founders, and the reason their walls had stood 1,000 years where the maker's spells guttered in an hour. Build it first where it costs nothing, and only then where it costs everything, and let the second building be nothing but the patient tracing of the first. He did not know then whose line it was. He learned later, and the learning gave him no comfort. But that December he only knew that the ground had a line already in it, waiting, and that Helga had been right, and that the great ward would stand not on a fence he chose, but on stones a dead hand had set for reasons of its own, and he found in that a companionship across the years, one warder's work resting on another's, and he laid his first mark on the oldest of the sunken stones on the shortest day of the year, at the dead middle of the night. With the frost creaking under his knees and his breath smoking in the torchlight, and he meant it with the whole of his 7 years. It was 1 mark, the first letter of the first ring of a wall that would take a year to raise. It was nothing, a scratch of soot and blood paste on a frostfurred stone in a Surrey garden, the smallest possible beginning of the founder's work. Under a hill 400 miles to the north, it woke something that had been asleep since before the conquest. The deep halls of Gringotts do not run to the vaults the wizards see. Below the carts and the dragons and the marble counting floors, below the deep vaults where the old families keep their gold, the goblin roads go down and down into the roots of the mountain that the first iron singers hollowed when the island was young, and there in halls no wizard has walked, the oldest wards in Britain hold up the dark. They are goblin work sung into the ore and hammered into the stone across an age of ages, and they are alive in the way old things are alive, aware without waking, patient without sleeping, and they are strung together, hall to hall and root to root, into a single vast web of keeping that the iron singers call in their own tongue the weft, because to them the world is a cloth and the wards are the threads that hold it from unraveling. The weft felt the mark in the Surrey garden the way a spider at the center of its web feels a single thread plucked at the far dark edge of it. It was very faint. It was 400 miles off and made by a child's hand in cheap materials. But it was made in the old grammar, the true grammar, the grammar the Iron Singers had taught the wizard warders in the long ago before the falling out, and had not felt a wizard use in longer than the goblin nation had kept its ledgers. And the note of it ran up the weft from Surrey to the northern hills and arrived in the deep halls as a single clear wrong and right chord. Wrong because no wizard should be able to sound it, right because it was sounded true, cleanly, by a hand that knew what it was doing. And the goblins who keep the deep wards stopped their work and lifted their heads and listened, all of them at once, the way a household wakes at a knock in the night. In the lowest hall, where the eldest of the Warders' Guild had sat at the loom of the weft for 200 years, and had not been surprised by anything for the last 150 of them, an old goblin named Bragnock put down his hammer and did not pick it up again for a long time. He was old even as goblins reckon age, and goblins reckon it long. He had a face like a walnut left in a forge, brown and cracked and hard, and eyes the flat black of anthracite, and he had been a warder since before the wizards built their ministry, since before their statute, and he had kept the deep weft through wars the surface world had forgotten it fought. He had heard in his 2 centuries at the loom, the weft ring with earthquake and flood and the death of dragons, and once, memorably, the failed treachery of a wizard cursebreaker who had tried to unpick a vault ward from the inside, and had been unmade by it so thoroughly that Gringotts had returned to his widow a box of teeth. He had not, in all that time, heard the weft ring with a wizard's hand sounding the old grammar true. He listened to the faint, clean note from the south, and he read it as a warder reads, and what he read in it was this: a keeping newly begun, the first ring of a great ward, laid on a founder line in the founder's own grammar, by a hand small and untutored and entirely without fear, a hand that did not know it was doing the impossible and so had simply done it. And under the note, fainter still, the signature of the grammar itself, the particular turn and lean of the letters, which Bragnock knew because the Iron Singers forget nothing and keep everything, and he had seen that hand before, 1,000 years before, in the one wizard warder the goblins had ever fully trusted, the Badgerwitch, the Yellow Founder, the only one of the 4 who had come to the deep halls not as a master to a tool but as a keeper to keeper, and had been let in. And had kept the secret of it till she died. Helga's hand, said Bragnock to the dark in the goblin tongue, and the dark did not answer, and he sat with it a while, because a thing 400 miles away and 1,000 years late is a thing an old goblin may take an hour over. Then he rose and he went up through the goblin roads to the counting floors, and he did a thing the Warders' Guild had not done in living memory, which was to request of the directors leave to walk in the wizard world on the guild's own business. And the directors, who feared the Warders' Guild more than they feared the wizards, granted it and asked, as directors will, what the business was, and Bragnock told them the truth, because goblins do not lie to their own, and the truth was this: the Badgerwitch's craft has woken in a wizard child. I am going to look at it. If it is what I think it is worth more than the gold in every vault we keep, and it is in the hands of a 7-year-old in Surrey, and we are not the only ones who will have felt it. The directors were quiet for a while after that, in the way that means gold is being counted behind the eyes, and then the eldest of them said the thing that goblins always say when a thing of great value appears in weak hands, which was, then it must be secured, and Bragnock looked at him with the flat anthracite eyes and said, it will not be secured, it will be met. There is a difference, and if you have forgotten it, you have forgotten why the deep halls have never fallen. And he went, and no one stopped him, because no one stops the eldest of the Warders' Guild when he has that look, not even a room full of goblins with gold behind their eyes. Harry felt him coming before he saw him, and that, more than anything that followed, was the thing that told Harry the world had changed. He had felt the owls and the cats and the still man in the heavy coat, but he had felt them the way you feel eyes on the back of your neck, a prickle, a guess. He felt the goblin the way you feel a train coming through the soles of your feet before you hear it, a pressure in the ground itself, in the sunken founderstones he had spent the winter learning, a deep slow resonance running up the buried line from somewhere and arriving under number 4 3 days before its owner did, so that Harry stood in the frozen garden on a Sunday morning with his hand on the fence and felt the old line humming under his palm, humming in a register he had never sounded. A register below anything the book had taught him, and he understood that something was walking toward him along the deep places of the world that knew the grammar older and better than he did, and that it had felt his first mark, and that it was not hurrying because it did not need to. He read late that night, hunting for the Iron Singer's passage again, reading it now not as history but as instruction, and he found under it a line he had skimmed before and now could not stop reading. When one of them comes to thee, and one of them will, if thou dost the great work where the weft can feel it, then remember that thou art not their equal and do not pretend to be, and remember also that thou art not their servant and do not let them make thee one. Stand as a keeper stands. Show them thy hands and thy work and thy honest ignorance, and offer them the one thing they cannot make for themselves and cannot buy, which is a wizard who will speak to them as Helga spoke to them, warder to warder, across the falling out. They hold themselves higher than any people in the world, and are the loneliest, for they have kept the deep wards alone for 1,000 years, while the wandkind called them beasts. And a child who comes to them knowing what they are is a thing they have not seen since me, and they will not know at first whether to treasure thee or to bury thee, and thy whole task in that first meeting is to be worth treasuring and too much trouble to bury. Harry read that 4 times and put it in the ledger, and did not sleep much, and was ready as a 7-year-old can be, when the Iron Singer came. He came at dusk on the Wednesday, in the blue hour when the street lights have come on but the sky has not yet gone black, and he came up Privet Drive on foot, alone, and he was not disguised as a man, or rather his disguise was the goblin's oldest and best, which is simply to be beneath notice, to be the small bent shape at the edge of the eye that the mind files as a child or a dwarf or a trick of the light, and does not look at twice. He wore a long coat of a gray that was almost the gray of the evening, and he walked with a stick that was not for leaning on, and he stopped at the mouth of the warded alley, and Harry, watching from the cupboard vent, saw him stop and saw him look at the curb, at the low soot marks on the curb, and saw him tilt his walnut head and consider them the way a scholar considers an inscription in a language he had thought dead, and then deliberately, so that Harry would see it and understand it. The goblin lifted his stick and did not cross the curb hush but bowed to it, a small, precise inclination of the head, one warder acknowledging another's work, and Harry understood the message as clearly as if it had been spoken. I could cross this. I am not going to, because it is yours, and I have come to talk, not to take. Harry went out to meet him. He did not have to. He could have stayed behind his wards, and the goblin could not have made him come out, not without breaking a keeping he had just bowed to. But Helga had said be worth treasuring, and a boy who hides behind his wards from a guest who has bowed to them is not worth treasuring. He is only afraid, and Harry had decided, somewhere in the long winter, that he was done being only afraid. He put on his coat and he walked out of the front door of number 4 while the Dursleys watched television, and he walked down the dark garden to the mouth of the alley, and he stopped on his own side of the curb hush, and he looked at the goblin across it, a 7-year-old boy in a hand-me-down coat and a very old goblin in a coat the color of dusk, with a line of soot magic between them that both of them could have crossed and neither of them did. "You are younger than I was told," said Bragnock. His English was old and exact, each word set down like a coin on a counter. "And you have warded your curb against the seeking eye with a paste of soot and spit and blood, which is a poor material and a true grammar, and it turned 2 of my director's spies at this spot last week, and they came back and could not tell me why, which is the best joke I have had in 50 years. Do you know what you have done, wizard child, laying the founder's line on the founder's stones in a garden in Surrey?" "No," said Harry, because it was true, and because Helga had said show them thy honest ignorance. "I know what the book told me to do. I don't know what it means that I did it. I was hoping." And here he did the thing that a 7-year-old should not have been able to do, which was to keep his voice level and his eyes on the anthracite eyes and his hands still at his sides, "that you might tell me. You came a long way, you bowed to my curb. I think you know things about what I'm doing that I don't, and I'd rather learn them from you than find them out the hard way, which is how I've learned everything else." The goblin looked at him for a long moment, and something moved in the walnut face that was not quite a smile, because goblins do not smile as men do, but was of the same family, and Bragnock said, "Helga said very nearly those words to my grandmother's grandmother in the deep hall 1,000 years ago, and my grandmother's grandmother let her in. Do you know why the wizards and the Iron Singers had their falling out, child?" "No," said Harry again. "Because the wizards learned to make," said Bragnock, "and making is loud, and the loud always come in the end to despise the quiet. They forgot who taught their fathers to keep. They called us beasts and took our gold work and locked us out of their councils and set laws on us that a dog would refuse, and we withdrew into the deep places and kept our own wards and let their world do without ours, and their world has been the poorer for 1,000 years and does not know it, because the poorer you are the harder it is to know it. Only one of them ever came down to us as a keeper and not a master. Only one of them ever said, 'Teach me to keep as you keep, and I will not sell it, and I will not boast of it, and I will bury it against the day your children and mine have need.' And she kept her word, which no wizard had ever done, and she died, and we thought the last bridge between us and the wandkind had died with her." He tilted the walnut head. "And now her hand is scratching soot on a curb in Surrey, in the fist of a boy of 7 who does not know what he is. So I have come to find out whether you are the bridge come again, or only the last echo of it, or something else, something the wandkind will use as they use everything and then break." And that was the whole of it, laid out plain, and Harry understood that he was being weighed, and that the scale had a bottom he did not want to fall through, and he did the thing he had come out to do, which was to show his work. He knelt by the curb in the dark in front of the oldest living warder in Britain, and he unmade the hush he had built, unpicked it letter by letter, and named each letter aloud as he lifted it. keeping, doing, standing against anchor, so the goblin could hear that he knew not just the marks but the grammar under them. And then he built it again, better, faster, and set into it a refinement he had worked out over the winter that the book had not taught him. A second standing against folded inside the first so that the hush turned the seeking eye but let the friendly eye through, which meant a warded thing could be hidden from its hunters and still findable by its friends. And he had never shown this to anyone because there was no one to show, and he showed it now to the goblin because he understood with the flat certainty that the only currency that would buy him standing with this creature was competence, honestly come by and honestly displayed. Bragnock watched the whole of it without a word, and when it was done he was quiet for a long time, and then he said in a different voice, lower, the voice of a craftsman looking at a thing he had not expected to see again in the world, "You folded a friend gate into a turnaway. At 7, untaught." He looked at the boy kneeling in the frost. "The badger witch could not do that until she was 30. She wrote to us that she never fully mastered it." The anthracite eyes came up to Harry's face, and what was in them now was the one named thing Harry let himself recognize that whole strange night, which was awe, plain and reluctant, and coming from a creature 200 years old at the sight of a child. And it was the first time in Harry's life that anyone had looked at him and seen something worth being awed by, and he put the feeling of it away carefully in the ledger to be taken out on the very worst nights because he suspected, correctly, that there would be nights bad enough to need it. "So," said Bragnock, and the awe was gone, folded back under the walnut face, and the counter-voice returned, the voice of a people who deal. "You are the bridge come again, or near enough that I will treat you as it until you prove otherwise. Which brings us to the matter of what I am to do with you, and what my directors will want done with you, and these are not the same thing, and you had better understand the difference before the night is out, because your life may turn on it." "Tell me," said Harry. "My directors," said Bragnock, "will want you secured. That is their word for it, and it is a soft word for a hard thing. They will offer you an apprenticeship in the deep halls, which will sound like a gift and be a cage. They will offer your family gold, which they do not need since your family are Muggles who would faint at the sight of a vault, but they will offer it anyway, because gold is the only handle goblins trust. And behind the gift and the gold there will be an oath, a goblin oath, which is not like a wizard's oath, child. A wizard's oath is words and a goblin's oath is iron. It is sung into your name and it does not come off, and once you have sworn it, your craft is the guild's craft, and your keepings are the guild's keepings, and you are in every way that a fierce old people can arrange ours." He let that sit. "That is what they will want. It is not what I want." "What do you want?" said Harry. "I want a bridge," said Bragnock, "not a possession. A possession is a thing you use until it breaks. A bridge is a thing that stands between two shores and belongs to neither and is used by both and is honored by both because both need it. Helga was a bridge. She swore us no oath. She took no gold. She gave us her word and she kept it, and her word kept was worth more to the deep halls than any oath sung into a name, because an oath binds a slave and a kept word binds a friend, and a friend cannot be taken from you, only lost, and we never lost her. She was only taken by time, which takes everyone." The old goblin leaned on his stick that was not for leaning. "I am too old to want another possession, child. I have possessed things for 200 years and they have all bored me. I would like, before I go into the stone, to see one more bridge stand. So here is what I offer you, and it is not an oath, and you may refuse it and walk back into your house, and I will not stop you, and neither will my curb bow be unbowed." Harry waited. The frost creaked. Somewhere behind him the Dursleys' television laughed at something. "I offer you a token," said Bragnock, and he took from inside the dusk-gray coat a nail. It was black and it was not rusted, and it was, Harry knew the moment he saw it, the same metal as the box and the book, the pale dark unrusting iron of the Founder's things, except that this nail sang faintly in the register below hearing, the register Harry had felt coming up the buried line, and Harry understood that he was looking at goblin iron, true iron singer work, the first he had ever seen. "It is anchor iron," said Bragnock. "It remembers deeper than any iron you will find in a Surrey shed. Set it in your great ward when the time comes at the keystone, and your wall will stand on iron the weft itself can feel, and if ever your keeping is breached, if ever you are in true need, the nail will ring in the deep halls, and I will hear it, and I will come or send if I am able. That is all it does. It is not an oath. It binds you to nothing. It is a door I am leaving open, one keeper to another, and you may use it or never use it as you choose. But take it so that you have it, because I do not think, child, that the wand kind will leave you as long alone as I would like." Harry looked at the nail singing in the goblin's cracked palm, and he understood everything that it was and everything it was not, and he understood that he was being offered by the oldest warder in Britain, the thing Helga had said he might one day be given and had not promised he would be, a door under the hill left open, warder to warder, and he reached across the curb hush, across the line that both of them could cross and neither had, and he took the nail, and it was warm, and it sang. Closed his hand on it and said, "Thank you, I'll keep it safe. And when the wall is built, if you want to come and see it, you won't have to bow at my curb, you can come in, I'll fold you a friend gate." And Bragnock laughed, which goblins almost never do where a wizard can hear, a short hard bark like iron on iron, and he said, "A friend gate for a goblin in a wizard's ward." He He shook the walnut head. The Badgerwitch would have wept. Build your wall, bridge, build it true, and build it soon. And he inclined his head again, the small, precise bow, this time to Harry and not to the curb, and he turned and walked back down Privet Drive into the blue dark, the small bent shape at the edge of the eye that the mind does not look at twice. And he was gone, and Harry stood in the frost with a singing nail in his fist, and understood that he had, that evening, at the age of 7, opened a door between the wizard world and the Iron Singers that had been shut for 1,000 years. And that he had done it not with power but with competence and honesty and one folded friend gate, exactly as Helga had said he must, and that somewhere far to the north an old goblin was walking home through the deep places smiling a smile no wizard would ever be allowed to see. But a goblin does not walk out of the deep halls and up into Surrey and back without the wizard world noticing, because the wizard world watches the goblins as a wary man watches a dog he has wronged, and by the next morning it was known in certain offices of the ministry that a senior member of the Gringotts Warders Guild, a body that had not sent a member into the wizard world on open business in over a century, had walked to a Muggle town in Surrey and back alone and told no one why. And the offices of the ministry are leaky offices, and the news ran from them along the quiet channels by which news runs in the wizard world, and it arrived within the day at the one desk in Britain where it fitted into a shape already half drawn, on a list already half written, beneath a word already underlined twice, and the very old wizard in the tower in the north read the small report about the goblin's walk, and set it beside the report about the warder's line. And beside Arabella's letter about the too quiet boy, and he understood that his time of watching was ending, because the pieces on his board had begun to move themselves, and a wizard who has waited too long to make his move discovers that the game has started without him. He rose and he took down his traveling cloak from behind the door where it had hung, gathering dust for 6 unbroken years, and he did not put it on, not yet, but he held it, and he looked out the window toward the south, toward Surrey, toward a house he had chosen with such care and such certainty and such catastrophic incompleteness, and he said to the phoenix, or to himself, or to the boy 400 miles away who could not hear him, "What have you found, I wonder, and who found it first?" And the phoenix, who had lived even longer than the wizard and had fewer regrets, said nothing at all. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. What the headmaster fears. Albus Dumbledore had built his long life on a single quiet certainty, which was that he could see further than anyone else in the room, and in the last week of January that certainty developed, for the first time in a very great while, a crack. He sat in his tower with the reports fanned across the desk in front of him, and he read them again, though he had them by heart. The instrument that watched the house in Surrey, ringing now on a pitch it had never been made to ring. The letters from Arabella growing shorter and more frightened, the last of them only a single line. "I cannot see the boy properly any more, Albus. My eyes slide off him in the street, and I have known him since he was 1. And the small, dry ministry memorandum, procured through channels he did not enjoy using, recording that a senior warder of the Gringotts Guild had walked openly to a Muggle town in Surrey and back, and told no one why. He laid them side by side, the 3 of them, and he did the thing he had done all his life, which was to draw a line through them and find the shape they made, and the shape they made was a boy of 7 who had come, by some road Dumbledore could not see, into possession of a magic older than the school Dumbledore ran. He did not like not seeing the road. He had spent 90 years training himself to see roads, and the not seeing sat in him like a stone he had swallowed, and he examined it honestly, because honesty with himself was the one discipline he had never let slip, even in the years when honesty with everyone else had become a luxury he could no longer afford. What he found, examining it, was not curiosity, though curiosity was there, it was fear. He named it to himself plainly, because a named fear can be set to work. He was afraid because for 6 years he had built his whole design for the boy, and through the boy his whole design for the war he knew was coming back on the foundation of the boy's helplessness. A helpless child could be protected and guided, and when the terrible time came, be brought gently to understand what would be asked of him. A child who at 7 had warded his own mind against a nation's spies was not helpless, and a peace that is not helpless is a peace that may not, when the board is finally set, consent to be moved. He turned that over for a long time, and he did not flinch from the ugliness of it, that he had wanted the child helpless, that some deep old part of the machinery of his planning had been relieved, all these years, to think of James and Lily's son as small and unremarkable and safe in a cupboard, because small and unremarkable and safe was also biddable, and biddable was what the greater good, in the end, required. He had told himself for 6 years that he left the boy in Surrey out of love, and there was love in it, real love. He was not a man who could lie to himself about the presence of love. But there had been calculation braided through the love so tightly that he could no longer, sitting in his tower at 90, pull the two apart, and the arrival of a warded child at the far end of his instruments was forcing him at last to look at the braid and see how much of it was rope. So he decided to go himself, which he had sworn for 6 years he would not do, and he understood that the going was itself a confession that the plan had slipped its rails, and he went anyway because a man who has built his life on seeing further cannot bear, past a certain point, not to look. Harry felt him coming a full day before he arrived, and the feeling was not like the goblin. The goblin had come along the deep places, a pressure in the buried stone, a train through the soles of the feet. This came down out of the sky and along the wind and through the wards themselves, and it was enormous. Harry had built 3 of the 4 rings by now, through the long winter, 1 mark a night, and the turning ring and the crossing ring and the binding ring stood complete around number 4, invisible, patient, humming to him alone. And on the Tuesday afternoon he felt all 3 of them lean at once, the way trees lean before a storm that has not yet arrived, and he knew, standing in the frozen garden with his hand on the fence, that something was coming that his wards could feel from a day away. Which meant something larger than the goblin, larger than anything he had yet met, a wizard whose mere approach bent a great ward like wind bends grass. He read that night by torchlight, hunting Helga for the one kind who were strong, and he found the passage, and it did not comfort him, and he had stopped by now, expecting comfort. There are among the makers, she wrote, a very few in any age who have grown so strong in the loud arts that they have circled all the way back round to the quiet one, and learned, late and partial and grudging, a little of the keeping. They are the most dangerous men alive, for they have a maker's power and a warder's cunning both, and they will feel thy wall and know it for what it is and want it, and being makers they will not think to ask thee for it as the iron singers asked. They will think, as makers always think, that a thing which exists is a thing to be used, and a child who holds it is a lock to be picked. Do not fight such a one. Thou canst not yet, perhaps not ever. But mark this, a great warder's strength is also his blindness, for he is so used to seeing through every defense that he has forgotten what it is to meet when he cannot see through, and there is no man on earth easier to surprise than the man who believes himself impossible to surprise. Hold thy wall, show him nothing, and let his own certainty be the door thou closest in his face. Harry read that 4 times, and then he did the thing he had been putting off for weeks, the thing he had built toward without admitting it, and he warded his own mind. It was the hardest keeping he had ever attempted, harder than the great ward's rings, because the anchor of it could only be himself, and Helga had said the mind will not be warded by a warder who does not know his own name, and Harry still did not fully know his, but he knew enough now after the winter. He knew he was the boy who had turned 5 bullies at a line and a grown man at a door, and had opened a shut door under a hill with nothing but honesty and 1 folded gate. That was not the whole of who Harry Potter was, but it was true, all of it was true, and a ward can stand on a partial truth if every part of it is sound. So he anchored a hush in the truth of himself, drawn not in soot but in attention, in the turning of his own mind looked past nothing here, and he set it against the seeking eye that reads thoughts, which Helga named the deepest and rudest of the maker's arts, and he meant it with everything the winter had made him, and he felt it felt a quiet close over his thinking like water closing over a dropped stone, and he understood that he had built inside his own skull a cupboard no unwelcome mind could open, and he did not know yet whether it would hold against the thing that was coming, and he would find out on the Wednesday. Dumbledore came at 4 in the afternoon in the flat grey light, and he did not come in a way anyone on Privet Drive could see, because for all his sudden humility he was still Albus Dumbledore and did not announce himself to Muggles. He arrived at the mouth of the road where the warded alley met the pavement, and he stopped. He stopped because he had walked into the turning ring, and the turning ring did not know him from any other seeking eye, and it turned him. It was the gentlest thing. He felt his own attention slide off the house he had come 400 miles to see, slide off it and onto a lamp post, a hedge, a parked car, the ordinary furniture of an ordinary street, and he felt his feet of their own accord begin to carry him past the turning to number 4 and on toward the next road, on some errand his own mind had helpfully invented for him. And he was 3 steps past before the part of him that had never once in 100 years been wrong about the important things reached out and took hold of the rest of him and said, "Stop." He stopped. He stood on the pavement of an ordinary Surrey street, the greatest wizard alive, and he understood that he had just been turned aside from a house by a hush of such subtlety, and reached that he, Albus Dumbledore, had very nearly walked past his life's whole design without noticing it was there, and the understanding did something to him that nothing had done in a long time. It made him careful. He drew himself in, closed his own mind to its smallest and hardest point, and looked at the house not with his eyes, which the ward turned, but with the deeper sight, and what he saw stopped his breath in his old chest. Rings. 3 great rings of keeping, one within another, laid on a line in the ground he recognized. A founder line, one of the old lines the 4 of them had strung across Britain when the school was young, and he had thought every one of those lines dead 1,000 years, and here was one woken and built upon, and the building was not ancient. The building was new. The paste was weeks old. Someone had raised over a single winter in a Surrey garden, a great ward of a kind that Albus Dumbledore had read about in exactly 1 book, a book he had believed to be the only surviving copy in the world, a book locked in his own office behind his own wards, and the someone was 7 years old and was, at this moment, on the far side of that wall, waiting for him, and knew he was there. Dumbledore stood on the pavement for a while and thought about turning around and going home. He did not, of course, but he thought about it, and the thinking was the most honest thing he had done in years, because what he thought was, I could leave the boy his winter's work and his secret and his terrible early strength, and let him grow, and come to him in 4 years with a letter and hope he has grown kind. And against it he set the other thing, the thing that had run his life. But I cannot see how he came by this, and I cannot see what he will do with it, and I cannot see, and the war is coming, and a piece on the board I cannot see is a piece that may be the enemy's before it is ever mine. And the second thought won as it had always won, because Dumbledore had built himself so that it would always win, and he walked up to the crossing ring, and he did not try to force it, because he had learned better in the last 400 yards than in the last 40 years, and he stood at the line and he said, aloud to the house in a voice pitched for one listener, My name is Albus Dumbledore, and I knew your mother and your father, and I have come to talk with you. And I will not cross any line you have not opened to me. May I come in? Inside the cupboard, Harry heard him. Not the words at first, but the shape of them arriving at the crossing ring, a knock made of courtesy instead of force, and he understood that the enormous thing at his gate had chosen to knock rather than break, and that this told him more about it than any spy's report, because a thing that could break and chooses to knock is either kind or clever, and Harry had learned not to bet on kind. He came out. He walked down the winter garden in his gray coat, and he opened the crossing ring for one guest only, folding a friend gate into it as he had promised the goblin he could, and he stood at the line, a small boy with taped glasses and a scar, and looked up at the tallest, oldest, strangest man he had ever seen, silver-bearded, half-moon spectacled, dressed in robes the color of a midnight that had decided to be cheerful about it. And the two of them regarded one another across a line that one of them could not cross and the other would not. You built a friend gate, said Dumbledore, and there was something in his voice that Harry, the reader of sentences, heard clearly, and it was the one named thing he let himself name that whole gray afternoon, and it was not the old man's warmth, which was real, and it was not his sorrow, which was also real. It was fear. The greatest wizard alive was afraid of a 7-year-old, and he was too honest and too old to hide it entirely, and Harry heard it and stored it, and understood that the meeting he was in was more dangerous than the ditch and the goblin put together, precisely because the thing across the line was afraid, and a power that great and that uneasy is the kind that decides in the end to break what it cannot hold. You're the one the instruments belong to, said Harry. It was not a question. He had felt the far-off watching for months and had guessed its owner as he guessed everything, by working backward from the shape of it. The silver thing that watches the house, that's yours. You put a keeping on this house before I ever found mine. I can feel it. It's under my rings, older, tied to something in the walls, tied to, and he stopped, because he had followed the old keeping to its root the way the craft had taught him and had found the root and did not want to say it, and Dumbledore watched the child find it, and something crossed the ancient face. Tied to your mother's blood, said Dumbledore quietly, because he would not let a child say a thing that hard alone. Yes. When your mother died to save you, Harry, she left a protection in you and your blood, the oldest and least understood of all the keepings, and I anchored it to this house, to your aunt, who shares that blood, so that while you can call this place home, no one who wishes you harm can touch you here. It is why I left you with them. I need you to understand that, whatever else you come to think of me. I left you in a hard house because it was a safe one, and I told myself the hardness was a price worth paying for the safety, and I have wondered every year since whether I was right, and I do not know, and I am telling you I do not know, because you have built a wall that tells me you deserve the truth more than you deserve my comfort. And Harry, standing at the line, heard all of it, the truth and the love and the calculation braided through, and he could not, at 7, pull the 3 apart any more than the old man could, but the craft had made him able to feel the braid, and what he felt was that every word was true and that the truth was being used, gently, expertly, the way a locksmith uses the truth of a lock, and he understood that he was being managed by a master of managing. And that the management was not cruel and might even be kind and was management all the same. So he did what Helga had told him to do with such a one. He showed him nothing. He kept his face to the blank obedient nothing and his mind behind its hush, and he let the old man's certainty be the door he closed in his face. You're trying to read my mind, said Harry. You've been trying since I came out. I can feel it like fingers on a lid. It's not working, is it? Dumbledore was silent for a moment, and in that silence was an admission larger than any word. He had indeed been reaching, gently, delicately, with the lightest touch of the deepest legilimency in the world, the touch that even trained Clumens rarely felt, and he had met, where the child's surface thoughts should have lain open as any child's, a hush. Not a wall thrown up in panic, those he could break. A hush quiet and total that turned his seeking mind aside as the turning ring had turned his feet, so that every time he reached for the boy's thoughts his attention slid off onto some harmless nothing. and he had reached 7 times and been turned 7 times, and the child had felt every one of them and named it, and was now telling him so to his face, and there was no one alive, no one in 40 years, who had felt Albus Dumbledore's legilimency, and lived to describe it as fingers on a lid. No, said Dumbledore, and he inclined his silver head, and it cost him something, and Harry watched it cost him. It is not working. You have warded your own mind at 7 against an art that grown men train a lifetime to resist and mostly fail. May I ask where you learned it? I think I know the answer. I think it is the same place you learned the wall. And I think that place is a book, and I think I should very much like to know how a book that I believed unique, and that sits behind 7 wards in my own office, came to have a twin in a garden in Little Winging. There it was, the reach, gentle as everything the old man did, for the one thing Harry would never give, the box, the book, Helga, the door under the hill, the whole secret country he had built his life on. Dumbledore had not asked to take it. He had only expressed a wish to understand it, which is how the clever take things, by making the taking feel like a conversation, and Harry, who had spent his whole life watching things that were his become things that were not, felt the old cold certainty settle in him, and he answered from behind his hush in the level voice the craft had given him. I found it, said Harry. That's all I'll tell you, and I'll tell you why I won't tell you more, so you don't have to wonder. Everything that's ever been mine, someone bigger has taken, because they decided they knew better what to do with it. You're the biggest yet, and you know better than anyone, and you've already decided, I can hear it, that the book would be safer with you, behind your 7 wards, where you could study it and keep it out of the wrong hands. And maybe you're right, you're probably right, but it's mine, it found me. It waited 1,000 years for me and not for you, and if I give it up because a great man told me it would be safer, then I've learned nothing from it at all, because the very first thing it taught me was how to keep what's mine from people exactly like you. He paused, and then he added, because he was 7 and could not quite help it, you said my mother kept me by dying. I keep me by not giving my things away. It's the same magic. You told me so yourself. Albus Dumbledore, who had turned dark lords and outmaneuvered ministers and buried nearly everyone he had ever loved, stood at a line in a Surrey garden and was, for the first time in a length of years he could not readily count, entirely without his next move. Because the child was right, and the rightness was built out of Dumbledore's own words, and there is no argument so hard to answer as your own truth handed back to you by someone you underestimated. He could take the book. He had the power. He could break the wall in time, or wait the boy out, or simply overpower a 7-year-old, and every one of those roads was open to him, and every one of them was the road of the man he had spent 100 years trying not to become, the road of the greater good that begins with a reasonable theft and ends, he knew, he of all people knew, somewhere terrible. And he looked at the boy behind the wall, James's untidy hair and Lily's green eyes, and a stillness that belonged to neither of them, that belonged to the cupboard and the winter and the book, and he made, standing there, the first wholly unselfish decision he had made about Harry Potter in 6 years, and it frightened him more than the wall had. No, said Dumbledore, to himself as much as to the boy. No, I will not ask you again, and I will not take it, and I will tell you plainly that I could, so that you know your wall did not stop me and my choosing did, because you should know the difference. It may save your life one day to know the difference between a man who cannot and a man who will not. He drew his cloak about him. I came here afraid, Harry, and I will leave here afraid, and I want to be honest with you about the shape of it, because you have earned honesty and I have spent too long giving you everything, but I am not afraid of you. I am afraid for you. A thing has woken in you that has been gone from the world for 1,000 years, and the world will feel it, is already feeling it, and not everyone who feels it will knock at your gate as I have knocked. Some will come to take and some will come to use, and at least one, I fear, will come to sell what you are to the worst buyer left alive, for there are men who served a master you are too young to remember, men who have been waiting in the cold years for any relic of power to trade their way back into his shadow. A founder's ward woken in a child is exactly such a relic. You have built a wall that will turn bullies and old men. I am not certain it will turn what may be coming. And so I will do the one useful thing left to me, which is to watch the roads and to come, if I can, when the worst of them arrives. You need not trust me, I would not in your place, but I will come, and I wished you to know it, so that when you feel a great strength approaching your gate again, you may at least wonder whether it is the one that means to help. Harry looked at him for a long moment. He could not read the old man's mind. He did not need to. He could read the sentences, and the sentences were true, and true in a way that was not this time being used, or if it was being used, it was being used against the old man's own interest, which was the only kind of truth Harry had learned to half-trust. He did not lower his wall, but he unfolded at the last one more thing across the line, a thing he had not planned to give. There's a nail, said Harry, in my keeping, iron. From under the hill, if the worst one comes and I ring it, someone else will come too, someone older than you at this. I'm telling you so that if you come and you feel him already there, you'll know he's on my side and you won't fight him, because I can't hold a wall against the worst one and referee a fight between the two people who came to help. That's all. That's the only thing I'll give you today. Dumbledore, understanding that he had just been told by a 7-year-old, that the boy had already made an alliance with the goblin nation that Dumbledore's whole century of statecraft had never managed, laughed once softly with no bitterness in it at all. Only a weary wonder, and he bowed, actually bowed, the tallest, oldest, strangest man in the world bowing to a child at a line of soot, and he said, "Then we are two of your allies, the goblin and I, and you are seven, and you have arranged us both. And I begin to think, Harry Potter, that the world has less to fear from what has woken in you than I supposed, and rather more to hope. Keep your wall, build your last ring, and mind the roads." And he turned and walked back up the garden, and at the turning ring he paused and looked back once and was gone, not with a crack but with a folding, a quiet stepping sideways out of the visible world, and the great ward closed smooth behind him as water closes over stone. Harry stood in the winter garden until the cold drove him in. He had held. He had shown the greatest wizard alive nothing, and kept his book, and made, without meaning to, a second wary ally, and every part of that was a victory, and he took no pleasure in it, because under the victory, plain and cold, lay the thing Dumbledore had come to tell him, the thing that mattered more than the book, or the wall, or the old man's baffled respect. Someone was coming who meant to sell what Harry was to the worst buyer left alive. The old man was afraid of that someone. The old man who had just been turned aside by a child's hush and had chosen not to break a child's wall was afraid, and Harry had learned that afternoon to weigh the old man's fear like gold, and the old man's fear said, "Finish the wall. Finish the last ring. Find the iron for the keystone, because the men in the cold years have felt you too, and they will not knock." Inside the house, the Dursleys had felt nothing at all. That was the part Harry turned over first, coming in out of the cold, because it was the part that steadied him. The greatest wizard alive had stood in their garden for the better part of an hour, had spoken his name into their winter air, had bowed to a child at a line of soot 10 yards from their television, and Uncle Vernon had watched the football results, and Aunt Petunia had done the ironing, and Dudley had eaten most of a Battenberg, and not one of the three of them had so much as glanced at the window. Because the turning ring had held over the whole plot, and turned the whole afternoon aside from their notice, as smoothly as it had turned the old man's feet. They had lived for an hour at the very center of the most important conversation of Harry's life, and they had missed it entirely, and Harry hung his damp coat on the peg and understood that this was the deepest strangeness of the craft and the truest. That it worked not by making great things happen but by deciding precisely who was allowed to see them, and that a boy who owned that decision owned a kind of power the Dursleys, for all their bulk and their bluster, would never in their lives so much as suspect existed. "You've let the cold in," said Aunt Petunia, without looking up from the collar she was pressing. "Get the tea on." "Yes, Aunt Petunia," said Harry, and got the tea on and buttered the bread, and stood at the stove being the plainest bread in England, while inside the ledger a whole nation of new facts sorted itself into its compartments. And he thought not for the first time that there was no better cover for a warder than a family who could not see him, and no colder one, and that Helga had been right about that too, that the boring life was the greatest ward and also the price of it, and that he had stopped somewhere in the winter being able to tell whether the Dursleys were his disguise or his sentence, or whether, by now, the two had grown into the same gray thing. He made himself hold still and count what he had actually done that afternoon, because a warder who does not measure his own victories will misjudge his next battle, and the measuring was sobering in both directions. He had turned Albus Dumbledore's feet at a hush. He had met Albus Dumbledore's mind with a hush of his own and turned it 7 times, and the old man had confessed aloud that it had never happened to him before, that grown wizards trained a lifetime to do a fraction of it and failed. A 7-year-old had done in one winter out of a buried book what the schooled and celebrated masters of the loud arts could not do in a career. That was the size of it, and Harry set it down honestly in the ledger, not because it was a comfortable thought, but because a true measurement was worth more than a comfortable one. And then he set down the other half of it, the sobering half, in the same plain hand, that turning Dumbledore's feet had cost the old man 3 steps and a moment's care, and turning Dumbledore's mind had cost him nothing but the small dignity of admitting it, and that neither turning had come close to the thing the old man was afraid of. Dumbledore had not fought the wall. He had knocked and talked and chosen to leave. The wall had never been tested by a will that meant to break it, and a wall untested by a true enemy is only a wall you hope will hold. The next one to come would not knock. And Harry understood, doing the sum, that everything he had built so far had been built against watchers, against the seeking eye and the reaching hand and the curious mind, and that none of it, not one ring of it, had yet been built against a wizard who came in the dark with a curse in his mouth and murder in his purpose, and that the last ring, the one Helga had refused him until now, was the only part of the whole wall that was meant for that, and that he had better learn it, and soon. Because the old man's fear had a name that had started south along the cold roads, and fear like that in a man like Dumbledore was never wrong. He got through the rest of the evening. He always got through the evening. and when the house had gone to its night breath, the fridge shuddering, the pipes ticking, the ninth stair still, he went out across the frozen grass to the shed, and he opened the box, and he did not, for once, go straight to the grammar. He sat with the book open on his knees, and he thought about the thing the old man had said that he had not let himself feel in the garden, because feeling it in the garden would have been a crack in the wall, and a warder does not crack his wall in front of a legilimens. I knew your mother and your father. Nobody had ever said that to him. Nobody. He had known in the flat factual way he knew things, that he had had a mother and a father, and that they had died in a car crash, which was the lie the Dursleys told, and he had felt about them roughly what he felt about the kings in Dudley's history book, that they had existed and were gone, and had nothing to do with the price of bread. And then an old man in ridiculous robes had stood at his gate and said your mother, your father, in the present tense of memory, as of people he had sat in rooms with, argued with, mourned, and something under Harry's ribs that had been shut so long he had forgotten it had a hinge moved half an inch, and let in a draught from a room he had never been allowed into. Your mother died to save you. She left a keeping in your blood, the deepest and least understood of all the keepings. Harry sat in the cold shed and looked at that. His mother had warded him. Before he could speak, before he could count, before the cupboard and the chores and the whole grey architecture of his life, a woman he could not remember had done the oldest magic in the world with her own death and anchored it in his blood, and it had held all these years under everything, so that the very first keeping Harry Potter ever carried was not one he had built, but one that had been built around him by someone who wanted, at the last, past all fear, only that he might live. He put his hand flat on his own chest, over the ribs, over the hinge, and he tried to feel it, the blood-keeping, the mother ward, and he could, faintly, far down under his own winter's work, a warmth that was not the horseshoe and not the box, a small steady warmth that had been there his whole life, and that he had never once thought to look for because no one had ever told him to look. And he understood, sitting there, why the name Anchor would not take from him, and what he would have to become before it would, because a boy who does not know he was loved cannot anchor a keeping in his own name, and a boy who has just found out he was loved can begin, at last, to learn it. He did not weep, because weeping was a thing the cupboard had trained out of him years ago, spent for nothing on people who would only use it against him. But he sat with the warmth under his ribs for a long time, longer than the craft strictly allowed, and when he finally moved it was to take from its hiding place the singing goblin nail, the anchor iron Bragnok had given him, and to hold it in one hand while the other stayed flat against the motherward in his chest, the oldest keeping he carried and the newest gift he had been given, iron out of the deep hill and blood out of a dead woman's love, and he thought, with the clean, cold clarity that was the best of what the craft had made him, this is the keystone, not the nail alone. The nail set on the doorstep over the mother ward, iron over blood, the gift of the iron singers wedded to the gift of Lily Potter, and on that, on those two loves that had never met and never would, the unmaking would stand and no curse in the world would cross it, because it would be anchored in the two deepest keepings a child had ever been given, and a wall built on love that strong does not fall. He had been waiting all winter for the iron he did not have. He had had all along the blood he had never thought to count. He understood now that the keystone had been complete the whole time, and only waiting for him to be told the one fact the Dursleys had spent 7 years keeping from him. And he understood, too, with a coldness that steadied rather than chilled him, that the old man had given him that fact deliberately, had chosen, out of all the things he might have said, to tell a warder the location of the strongest anchor the warder owned. And that this was either the kindest thing anyone had ever done for Harry or the cleverest, and that with Albus Dumbledore it would always, to the end, be both at once, and that Harry would have to build the rest of his life on the narrow ground between the two and never once mistake one for the other. He closed the box. He did not lay a mark that night. Some nights were for knowing and not for making. But he went back across the grass with the whole shape of the ending clear in him at last. 3 rings standing, the 4th designed, the keystone found, the iron in his hand and the blood in his chest, and out beyond the wall, somewhere on the cold roads, a man the old wizard was afraid of, coming south, not knocking. Harry had a wall to finish and a name to grow into, and he suspected, less time than he wanted to do either. He lay down in his warded cupboard with the goblin nail warm against the mother ward, and he did the sum of it one more time, and it came out, and it balanced, and it told him what every good sum had ever told him, which was exactly how much work was left and exactly that it could be done. 400 miles away, in a rented room above a shut shop in a town that had forgotten its own name, a man who had served the Dark Lord and gone to ground the night the Dark Lord fell sat over a cheap glass, and listened to the whisper that had reached him at last, 3 counties late, along the crooked channels by which such men still spoke to one another. That the goblins were stirring over something in Surrey, and old Dumbledore had gone to Surrey himself in person for the first time in years, over something in Surrey, and that the something had the smell of the old magic, the founder magic, the kind that did not exist anymore and was worth, to the right buyer in the right cold and patient hands, more than a vault of gold. Mordaunt Grieve had been a curse breaker once before the war and a good one, and he still had the tools, and he still had the debts, and he had spent 7 years waiting for exactly this, a thing worth stealing that would buy him back into the shadow of a master he did not believe, not for one moment, was truly gone. He finished the glass. He began that night to make his quiet way south, and he was very good, and he was very patient, and he did not knock. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. The grammar of binding Helga gave him the unmaking in the spring, when the 3 rings stood complete, and the founder line under the garden had gone from a buried memory to a living wall, and she gave it to him as she gave everything that could kill him, slowly, and with her whole heart in the warning. Now thou hast built the turning and the crossing and the binding, she wrote, in ink that woke a black so deep it seemed to drink the torchlight rather than reflect it. And thou hast proven to me across a winter I did not live to see that thou canst hold a thing without breaking it, keep a line without cruelty, turn an enemy without hating him past the turning. So I will give thee the last, and thou must hear me before thou learnest it. The unmaking is not a keeping like the others. The turning hides. The crossing bars, the binding holds, the unmaking destroys, and there is no gentle destroying, and a warder who forgets that has already begun to become the thing he was made to stand against. The unmaking does one work only, and it does it wholly. It takes a spell apart. When a maker throws his made thing at thee, his curse, his fire, his killing word, the unmaking meets it in the air and unpicks the grammar of it, unsays the sentence he spent his hate to speak, so that his magic comes apart into the nothing it was built from and falls at his feet as ash and silence, and he is left with an empty hand and an empty mouth and the whole of his strength spent on a wall that simply, quietly, refused to let his sentence be a sentence at all. It is the deepest thing the first wizards made, and it is the reason a warder in a cottage could stand against an army of makers, and it is the reason the makers hunted us, in the end, past all reason, because a man who has built his whole self on the power to make cannot bear the existence of a magic that can, without anger, without effort, without so much as raising its voice, unmake. Harry read that on a night in April with the shed door open and the first warm air of the year coming in off the garden, smelling of turned earth and the neighbors' cut grass, and he understood that Helga had saved this lesson for last not because it was the hardest to draw, but because it was the hardest to be trusted with, and that the whole of the winter, the discipline, the one Marcanite, the refusing of his own eagerness, had been Helga teaching him without telling him. To be the kind of person who could hold a magic that unmade and never once reach for it in anger. He had passed a test he had not known he was sitting. He sat with that, and then he learned the unmaking, and it was the most beautiful and most terrible grammar in the whole book. It was beautiful because it was, at its root, an act of reading. To unmake a spell, Helga wrote, thou must first read it, faster than its maker can finish speaking it. Read the 4 parts of it in the half-instant it hangs in the air between his wand and thy wall. Find its keeping and its doing and its standing against and its anchor, and then unpick them in the reverse of their making, last part first, so that the sentence comes undone from its end like a knot pulled by the right loose thread. It asked everything the winter had given him and more. The reader of sentences, grown so quick and so sure that he could read a stranger's whole grammar in the time it took the stranger to cast it, and answer it not with a bigger spell but with the exact small refusal that took it apart. Harry practiced it on the only made magic he had, which was his own, throwing small hushes and threshold flickers across the shed and unmaking them before they landed, and at first he was too slow and the little ward struck the far wall and guttered, and then over a fortnight of April nights he grew quick and quicker until he could throw a keeping with one hand and unpick it in the air with the other before it had crossed the shed, reading his own grammar backward faster than he could speak it forward. And the night he first did it clean, the little hush coming apart into nothing a foot from the wall it had been meant for, he sat in the dark with his hands shaking and understood that he had just done the thing that no living wizard could do, the thing the whole loud, forgetful modern world had let slip past possible, and that he was 7, and that it was April, and that somewhere a man was coming who would make him do it for real. The unmaking changed how he saw the whole world, and not only the small part of it that threw curses. Once a boy has learned to read a spell in the half-instant it hangs in the air, taking it apart from its end, he cannot stop reading. He reads everything all the time, the postman's grievance and the teacher's boredom and Aunt Petunia's daily grinding fear of the neighbors, all of it laid out to him now as sentences with 4 parts, keeping and doing and standing against an anchor, so that the world went from a fog he flinched through to a page he could read at a glance, and Harry moved through his spring days quieter and stiller than ever, a small gray boy at the back of every room, reading the room the way other children read comics, easily, hungrily. And without being caught at it once. It was the most useful thing the craft had given him and the loneliest, because a boy who can read every sentence in a room is a boy who knows, always, exactly how little of any of it is addressed to him, and Harry read that too, and set it in the ledger with the rest, and did not let it stop him. The mouth under the doorstep slept, and he tended it as you tend a thing that could turn on you, checking its anchor without waking it, and he understood a little more each week why Helga had made him wait, because every week his hands grew quicker, and every week the temptation grew with them to use the quickness for something smaller and meaner than keeping. And every week he refused it, and the refusing was the truest ward he built that spring, the one with no marks at all. He set the keystone on a Sunday at dawn, when the Dursleys slept and the street was empty, and the light came gray and even with no shadows to betray him. He knelt on the doorstep of number 4, the threshold stone, the true center of the whole wall, and he took the singing goblin nail in one hand, and he laid his other hand flat on his own chest over the mother ward, and he did the thing he had planned all winter and understood only in the last month. He wedded them. He drove the anchor iron into the mortar at the foot of the doorstep, iron out of the deep hill, and he anchored the unmaking ring in it, and then he reached down past the iron, past the stone, into the warmth under his own ribs, and he tied the far end of the keeping to the keeping his mother had made, iron over blood, the gift of the iron singers wedded to the gift of Lily Potter, and the two of them, meeting for the first time in a Surrey doorstep at dawn, recognized each other. Because deep keeping knows deep keeping, and the mother ward flared, gentle and enormous, and ran up the goblin iron and out along the founder line and into all 3 standing rings at once, so that for one gray breathless moment the whole great ward woke entire, the turning and the crossing and the binding and the unmaking, 4 rings and a keystone anchored in iron and blood, and the founder line under the garden rang like a struck bell in a register below hearing. And 400 miles to the north an old goblin at the loom of the weft lifted his walnut head and said to the dark, "There, he has set the keystone. The bridge stands, and far to the south on the cold roads, a patient man felt something in the earth change and did not yet know what it meant. Harry knelt on the doorstep with the whole wall alive around him and did not arm the unmaking. That was the last discipline and the hardest, and Helga had been clear as iron about it. An unmaking held ready is a knife left drawn in a house of children. It must be built and anchored and left sleeping and woken only in the half-instant of true attack, for a warder who walks about with an unmaking awake will, in time, on some bad gray morning, find a reason to use it, and there is always a reason, and that is exactly why it must sleep. So Harry built it and anchored it and put it to sleep, sealed behind the binding ring like a sword in a stone, and he stood up off the doorstep with the whole wall complete and dreaming and stepped back into his boring life, the plainest bred in England, a 7-year-old with a founder's fortress asleep beneath his aunt's begonias, and he waited because the waiting was all that was left, and Helga had taught him how to wait. The waiting was its own craft, and Harry learned it that spring as he had learned all the others, by breaking it into pieces small enough to hold. He could not simply wait. A warder who only waits grows soft in the waiting, Helga warned, and is slow in the hour he has waited for. So he trained, and the thing he trained hardest was the unmaking, because the unmaking was the one keeping that had to be perfect in an instant or it was nothing, and an instant is a thing you can only get right by getting it right 10,000 times. He built himself for the training, a cruelty he did not enjoy building. A small hostile ward, a striking thing, a made spell of his own that leapt off its anchor at a set signal and flew across the shed to strike whatever stood opposite. A toy curse, harmless, a hard flick of turned around keeping that stung like a wasp and nothing worse. And he set it to fire without warning at odd hours of his own choosing, so that he never knew, working at the bench, whether the next breath would bring the strike. And he practiced meeting it. He practiced reading the little curse in the half-instant it hung in the air, finding its 4 parts and unpicking it from the end. And at first it stung him 100 times a night, quick red welts up his forearms that he hid under his sleeves, because he was too slow, always a fraction too slow, reading the sentence at the speed a boy reads and not the speed a warder must. And then, over the slow warming weeks, he grew quick. He grew quick the way you grow quick at anything, by doing it past the point of thinking, until the reading and the unpicking stopped being 2 acts and became one. Until the little curse came apart in the air the instant it left its anchor, unmade before it had crossed a foot of shed, and the welt stopped coming, and Harry stood in the dark with his sleeves rolled up over unmarked skin, and understood that he had made his hands faster than any wand in England, not stronger, only faster. And that fast in the unmaking was the whole of the war. He learned the second hard thing about the unmaking that spring, which was that it did not care whose spell it ate. He tried it once carefully on the very edge of his own great ward, unpicking a single strand of his own turning ring and setting it back, to prove to himself that the unmaking would take even the founder's work apart if he asked it to, and it would. It came apart under the unmaking as readily as the toy curse had, and the readiness frightened him more than the toy curse ever had, because it meant the last ring was not a shield that knew friend from enemy. It was a mouth. It ate what it was pointed at, and the only thing standing between it and his own wall, between it and the Dursleys asleep upstairs, between it and Harry himself, was the warder's aim and the warder's will, and Harry understood then fully why Helga had made him wait a whole winter, why she had watched him refuse his own eagerness night after night before she would trust him with a thing that ate magic, because the unmaking in a careless hand would eat the hand that held it, and Helga had needed to know. Across 1,000 years that his hand was not careless, he put the lesson in the ledger in its own black compartment. The last ring is a mouth, point it once and be sure, and never twice. The waiting itself he bore by counting, as he bore everything. He counted the days of the lengthening light and the owls in the sycamore, which had thinned to one and then to none as the wizard world's attention drifted, satisfied for now that whatever had woken in Surrey was quiet. He counted the cats which stayed Mrs. Fig's patient weather, and he counted, most of all, the nights, each one a night the man on the cold roads had not yet come, each one a night nearer the one he would. He did not know when. He knew only that the old man had been afraid, and that the old man's fear had a name, and that the name was coming, and a countdown you cannot see the bottom of is the hardest kind to keep, and Harry kept it, because keeping was what he was now all the way down. Far to the north, the old man was keeping his own count and losing it. Dumbledore had set watchers on the roads, quiet ones, and for a month they had brought him nothing, and the nothing was itself the worst news, because a man who leaves no trace on a road is a professional, and a professional was exactly what Dumbledore had feared. He knew the shape of the thing hunting the boy now, if not its face. He knew it was patient and skilled, and had spent a very long time learning to move through the world without being seen, and he knew that his own watchers, good as they were, had lost it somewhere in the Midlands 3 weeks past and never found it again, and that the losing meant the thing was closer to Surrey than to the north, and closing. He sat in his tower and turned his traveling cloak over in his hands and did the arithmetic of distance and did not like the answer, which was that if the hunter moved tonight, Dumbledore was 400 miles too far to matter, and that everything now turned on a wall built by a child and on whatever help the child had arranged under the hill, and that Albus Dumbledore, who had spent a life arranging to be the one who arrived in time, was going to be, this once, in the thing that mattered most. Too late, he hated the answer. He kept it anyway because he had taught himself long ago that a hated true answer was worth more than a comfortable false one, and he sent, that night, the fastest word he could send to the only ally who might be nearer than himself, and then he sat, and he watched the south, and he waited, which was, he reflected without any comfort at all, the one thing he and the boy were now doing in common. The man came in May, and he was very good, and he did not knock. Mordaunt Grieve had been 3 months on the road south, and he had spent none of it hurrying, because hurrying was how curse-breakers died. He had learned his trade in the old ministry in the years before the war, breaking the wards on tombs and vaults and the houses of the recently and suspiciously dead, and he had been, by common account, one of the 3 best in Britain before he made the choice that ended his ministry career and could have ended his life, which was to break wards for the other side quietly, for a master who paid in power instead of gold. When the master fell, Grieve had not been caught, because a good curse-breaker leaves no wards he cannot also mend, and he had gone to ground and waited, and the waiting had gone on 7 years and worn him down to something lean and grey and patient and very, very good at getting into places he was not wanted. He did not believe, privately, that the master was truly gone. He believed the master was waiting, as Grieve was waiting, and that the wizard who brought the master when he returned, a relic of true power, a thing out of the deep past worth more than gold, would be the wizard who sat, thereafter, near the top of the new order. And so when the whisper reached him, 3 counties late, that there was founder magic loose in Surrey, old magic, dead magic, magic that did not exist any more, he had risen from his cheap glass and gone to sea, and he had spent 3 months making very sure, because a thing worth this much was also a thing other men would want, and Grieve intended to be the only one who came away with it. He found the house in April and did not touch it for a month. He watched as the others watched, from further off and better hidden, and what he saw made his old curse-breaker's blood run quick for the first time in 7 years. Wards, not the wizard wards he had broken 1,000 of, the family blood wards and the notice-me-nots and the standard ministry lattices that a professional could unpick in an afternoon. These were something else. These were rings, concentric, laid on a line in the ground that Grieve, who knew every kind of ward the modern world had a name for, could put no name to at all, and the not being able to name it was the thing that told him he had found what he came for, because a curse-breaker spends his life learning the names of things precisely, so that on the one day in his life he meets a thing with no name, he will know it for treasure. He studied the rings for a month from a distance, with instruments and with the naked deeper sight, and he learned 3 things, and being a professional he wrote none of them down. The rings were founderwork, older than anything he had ever broken. They were newly raised, which meant a living warder, which meant the relic was not a dead thing in a box but a living craft in a living head, which was better because a craft could be taken and taught and sold in a way a stone could not. And the warder was careless in exactly one way. The wall was magnificent, layered, subtle, all but unbreakable by force, but it had been built, Grieve could tell, by someone who had never yet been attacked by a professional, someone who had built against watchers and bullies and blunt intrusion, and had never once had to hold a wall against a man who broke walls for a living, and had all the time in the world and no scruple left in him at all. He was right about that, and it was the most dangerous thing anyone had yet been right about, and Harry did not know it, because Harry had never met a professional either. Grieve moved on a Tuesday night in the last dark before the moon, and he moved the way water moves, finding the low places because that was the whole of his art. He did not try to force the outer ring, he had felt it, the turning ring, the vast hush, and he was far too good to walk into it seeking the boy and be turned like a spy. Instead, he did the thing that only a curse breaker of the first rank would have thought of, which was to come to the house wanting nothing. He emptied himself on the dark road of every purpose, made his mind a blank gray nothing, thought not of the relic nor the boy nor the master nor the gold, thought only with the trained discipline of 30 years of the next step in the next, a man out for a walk in the dark with no destination, and the turning ring which turned the seeking eye and let the aimless one through, read his emptied mind and found nothing in it to turn and let him cross. He walked through Harry's outermost wall by the simple professional trick of, for the length of the crossing, genuinely not wanting anything at all, and he stood inside the turning ring on the pavement of Privet Drive with his empty gray mind and let himself, slowly, carefully, one again. The crossing ring was harder, and it was here that the old grammar first bit him, and the biting was the first warning Harry got. Grieve came to the crossing ring, the great threshold 3 feet inside the boundary, and he could not empty himself past this one, because this one did not read the mind, it read the intent in the body, the harm in the forward motion, and Grieve meant harm, meant it in his bones under whatever his mind pretended, and the crossing ring felt it and would not let him cross. He stood at the line and he smiled, because a ward that would not let him cross was a ward doing exactly what he expected, and a curse-breaker lives for the wards that behave, and he took from his coat the tools of his trade, and he began, with a patience 30 years deep, to unpick it. He worked at the crossing ring the way a locksmith works at a lock he respects, finding the anchor, finding the corner irons Harry had driven in December, and he began to draw the keeping out of them one strand at a time, and the crossing ring, being only a made thing after all, old as it was, began, strand by strand, to give. And in his cupboard 3 walls away, Harry woke because the corner iron at the northeast of the garden had begun to sing a note it was never meant to sing, the note of a keeping under attack, and the note ran up the founder line and into the nail in the cupboard wall and into the bones of the sleeping boy, and Harry sat up in the dark with the whole wall shrilling its alarm through him, and he knew, before he was fully awake, 3 things, that the thing the old man was afraid of had come. That it was already inside the turning ring, which should have been impossible, and that it was, at this moment, methodically, professionally, taking his wall apart from the outside, and that it was good, very good, better than the goblin at breaking though not at making, and that Harry had perhaps 10 minutes before the crossing ring failed. He did not panic. He had built the whole winter against this hour without letting himself name it, and now that it had come the naming was almost a relief, because a named enemy is an enemy you can fight. He put his hand on the goblin nail in the cupboard wall and he woke it, not the whole wall, only the nail, and the nail rang once hard in the register below hearing, and 400 miles north an old goblin at a loom stood up so fast he knocked his stool across the floor of the deep hall and said one word in the goblin tongue that meant, roughly now, and began to move with a speed no one had seen out of Bragnock in 50 years. Help was coming. Help was 400 miles away. Harry did the sum, and the sum said the help would not arrive in time, and so the sum said what it always said, which was that he would have to hold the wall himself until it did, and he got up, and he dressed in the dark, and he went out through the old kitchen door into the last dark before the moon to meet the man who had come to unmake his life. A light went on upstairs. Harry saw it from the garden, the yellow oblong of Uncle Vernon's bedroom window springing awake in the dark, and he understood the danger of it before he had finished seeing it, because the founder line had been shrilling its alarm through the whole house for 10 minutes now, below hearing but not below sleeping, a wrongness in the foundations that had reached even Uncle Vernon's thick dreams and dragged him up out of them cross and heavy and coming. Harry could hear the tread of it to the window. To see what fool was in his garden at this hour. And on the far side of the failing crossing ring, a lean gray professional was at that moment unpicking a founder ward with the whole of his attention, a man who had spent 30 years leaving no wards he could not mend and no witnesses he could not silence, and Harry did the sum in the space of a single breath, and the sum was the ugliest he had ever done, and it came out at once and left him no time to flinch from it. The man on the lawn would not leave a witness. Not a Muggle who had seen his face at this work. A curse breaker of that make did not obliviate where a quieter magic would do, and there was nothing quieter in the trade Grieve had learned than a witness who had never woken at all. Uncle Vernon was about to look out of the window at the man who had come to steal Harry, and the man who had come to steal Harry was about to see him do it, and Harry had perhaps 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds he made the choice that Helga had spent a whole book teaching him he would one day have to make, though she had never once named it because she had trusted him to name it himself when it came. He threw a hush over the house. Not a small one, the biggest and fastest he had ever thrown, a turning away flung up over the whole roof of number 4 in a single desperate sweep of will, no chalk, no paste, no time for either, only his own blood bitten from his thumb and smeared on the door frame, and the whole of his attention poured into 4 words meant with everything he had: do not see them. He anchored it in the house itself, in the bricks the Dursleys had lived in and hated him in for 7 years, and he named the standing against with a precision that cost him something he would examine later. The hunter's eye, turn it from the people in this house, all of them, the man and the woman and the boy, keep them, do not let him see. And the hush took, ragged and enormous, and the yellow window's light seemed to any eye outside the garden to simply go on being a curtained window with nothing behind it. And Uncle Vernon, reaching the glass, looked out into his own dark garden and saw nothing there at all, no boy, no gray man, no tools laid out on his lawn, because the hush had folded the whole scene away from him as smoothly as it had folded the goblin from the street, and he grumbled about foxes and drew the curtain. And went back to bed and never knew that his nephew had, in the space of 2 seconds and at the cost of the only unspent strength he had left, kept his life. Harry knelt on the wet grass with his thumb bleeding and understood what he had just done, and the understanding went all the way down to the place the name Anchor lived and had never taken. He had kept them. The Dursleys, who had put him in the cupboard and counted out his cheese and let him be hunted through woods and never once in 7 years said his name as a kindness. And he had spent his last strength to keep them, not because they deserved it. They did not. Deserving had nothing to do with it, but because he was a warder, and a warder keeps, and a warder who keeps only the deserving is not a warder at all but a judge. And Harry had decided, kneeling in the dark with his blood on the doorframe, that he would rather be the thing Helga had made him than the thing the Dursleys had tried to. He had kept the people who had never kept him. And somewhere under his ribs, in the room with the hinge, in the warmth his mother had left, something turned that had never turned before. Some last tumbler in a lock he had been failing to open all winter, and he understood, with no time at all to sit with it, that he had just become, in the keeping of his enemies, someone whose name would hold a ward, and that he would have to live to test it. He had no strength left for the wall. That was the price, and he had known it as he paid it, and paid it anyway. The great hush over the house had cost him the reserve he had been holding for the fight, and the crossing ring was failing, and the binding ring would go after it, and the man was coming, and Harry had spent his shield to hide 3 people who despised him, and he did not regret it, and he got up off the grass with his thumb bleeding and his knees wet and nothing left in his hands but the one thing he had built and never woken, the mouth under the doorstep, the last ring, the unmaking. And he understood that the whole battle had just narrowed to a single move, that he could not hold and could not run and could not shield, that everything now came down to whether he could bring a professional ward breaker to stand on one exact square of stone, and hold him there for the half-instant it took to wake a thing that ate magic and point at once and be sure. The crossing ring failed while he crossed the garden. He felt it go, felt the northeast corner iron give up its keeping all at once, felt the great threshold he had spent 11 winter weeks building come apart under a professional's patient hands, and he felt the man step across it, into the garden, into the space between the crossing ring and the binding ring, and Harry stopped on the wet grass 20 feet from the intruder and saw him for the first time. A lean gray man in a long dark coat, ordinary and terrible, with Cursebreaker's tools laid out on a cloth on the lawn like a surgeon's instruments, and a face with nothing cruel in it at all, which was the worst thing about it, a face that was only concentrating, only working, the face of a man doing a difficult job well. And the man looked up from his tools and saw, standing on the lawn in hand-me-down pajamas and taped glasses, the warder he had come 400 miles in 7 years to rob. And it was a child, and Mordaunt Grieve, who had not been surprised in a decade, was surprised. "You're a boy," said Grieve. His voice was quiet and gray and not unkind, which made it worse. "All this, the founderline, the rings, the mind-ward I felt from the road, a boy of what, 7? He tilted his head and something moved behind the concentrating face, and it was not mercy, it was calculation, the swift, cold recalculation of a professional discovering that the treasure is smaller and stranger and far more valuable than he had dared hope. "You built this. There's no one else here, is there? No old warder hiding in the house. It's you, a 7-year-old with the lost craft in his head." He began, without hurry, to pack certain tools away and take out others. "I came to steal a thing, boy. I find I have come to steal a person. That's a harder job and a richer one, and I've done harder. Stand still. I'm not going to hurt you if you stand still, because you're worth a very great deal to me undamaged and nothing at all in pieces. Stand still and let me take you to someone who will want to meet you very much, and it will go easier than you can possibly imagine." Grieve did not like the boy's calm. He had spent 30 years reading the faces of people he had come to rob, and calm, in a person who ought to be screaming, was the one expression that had ever cost him a scar, and so he tested it, the way a careful man tests ice before he trusts his weight to it. He lifted a hand, not the tool hand, the wand hand, and he spoke a word, low and gray and professional, and a curse left him and crossed the lawn toward the child on the doorstep, not a killing thing. He wanted the boy whole, but a binding thing, a snare of cold light meant to wrap a target arm and leg and drop him helpless on the stone. And Harry, who could have unmade it, who had spent all spring making his hands faster than any wand in England precisely so that he could take a thing like this apart in the air, did the hardest thing the craft had ever asked of him, which was nothing. He let it come. He read it in the half-instant, found its 4 parts, felt his trained hands ache to unpick it, and he held them still because to unmake it here, 20 feet from the doorstep, was to show Grieve the last ring, to teach a professional exactly what waited at the center of the wall and give him all the time in the world to plan around it, and a warder who shows his deepest keeping before the last instant has already lost. So Harry did not unmake the snare. He dropped instead, clumsily, a child's dodge, and took the edge of it across one shoulder, and the cold light wrapped his left arm to the elbow and clamped it to his side, and it hurt, a deep aching cold that ran to the bone, and he let it hurt, and he let his face show the hurt, because the hurt was the most useful thing he owned just then. It was the thing that would tell Grieve what Grieve wanted to hear. "There," said Grieve, and the wariness went out of his gray face, replaced by the small satisfaction of a professional whose read has proven correct. "You can't fight, I thought not. All that wall and nothing behind it but a clever child who built it, and no more idea how to hold it in a fight than a spider knows how to bite the boot. You've one arm now, and in a moment you'll have none, and then we'll go and meet the man who's going to be so very pleased with me." He came on across the lawn, unhurried, stepping over his own laid-out tools, wand loose in his hand, a man who had decided the job was essentially done and was only walking now to the finishing of it, toward the boy on the wet grass with one arm bound to his side, toward the last standing ring and the dark house and the doorstep somewhere beyond. Harry, down on the wet grass with the cold light clamped to his arm and his shoulder, singing, watched the professional come and did not fight and did not run, because the souled helplessness was the truest ward he had left, and behind the hurt he let show on his face the reader of sentences was already at work on the last cold sum, measuring the slow, unhurried steps between the gray man and one exact square of stone, because the sum did not care that his arm was bound. The sum had never needed his arm. It needed his aim and his will and the man to be brought at the chosen instant to the chosen place, and everything from here was only the patient tracing of a design he had built 100 times in the dark. And Harry, standing on the wet grass between the broken crossing ring and the binding ring that still held, with a professional ward breaker unpacking the tools to take him apart, and a goblin 400 miles too far to help, and an old wizard who might or might not come, and the whole of his winter's work suddenly, terribly real, did the thing the craft had made him. He read the man. He read him as he had learned to read everyone, the sentences under the words, and what he read was a professional, patient, unfrightened, unhurried, a man who had broken one ring and would break the next and the next because breaking rings was his whole life and he was very good at it, and Harry understood with the flat, cold clarity that was the best and worst of what Helga had made him, that he could not win this by holding. The rings would fall one by one to a man who broke rings for a living. Holding was the goblin's game and the old man's game. It was not tonight Harry's game. Tonight Harry had to do the other thing, the last thing, the thing that slept sealed under the doorstep behind the binding ring, the thing Helga had made him wait a whole winter to be trusted with. He backed toward the house, not in retreat, in position. He backed across the binding ring, which opened for him and closed behind him, and he stood on his own doorstep over the keystone, over the goblin iron and the mother ward, with the last ring sleeping under his feet, and he looked at the lean, gray, patient man taking his wall apart on the lawn, and he did the sum one final time, and it came out, and it was the coldest sum he had ever done, and he did not flinch from it, because a warder who flinches from the true sum builds a wall that falls. "You broke my crossing ring," said Harry, and his child's voice was steady, and that steadiness was the last warning Grieve would ever ignore. "It took me 11 weeks to build, and you took it apart in 10 minutes. You're better than me at breaking. I worked that out already, so I'm not going to try to stop you breaking." He set his bare feet on the cold stone of the doorstep over the sleeping thing, and he laid the whole of his attention on the man on the lawn, and far under the stone, under the iron, under the blood, the unmaking stirred toward waking, and Harry did not let it wake, not yet, not until the half-instant of true attack, exactly as Helga had taught him. "I'm going to let you come all the way in, and then I'm going to show you what the first wizards built the last ring for." Grieve, who had broken 1,000 wards and heard 1,000 warders threaten him and outlived everyone, smiled his concentrating smile, and picked up the tool that broke binding rings, and stepped across the failing edge of the third wall toward the child on the doorstep. And behind him, unseen, the broken crossing ring lay open to the night, and above him the moon came at last over the roofs of Privet Drive and laid its cold light on a lean gray man walking, with the confidence of 30 unbroken years, into the one place in England built precisely and lovingly, and 1,000 years ago, to unmake exactly him. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The first wizard's wall. Harry stood on the doorstep of number 4 with one arm bound in cold light and the whole of his winter under his bare feet, and he waited for the gray man to take the last step, because the whole of the war had come down, as he had always known it would, to a single square of stone, and the precise moment a professional set his boot upon it. Grieve came to the binding ring last of all, the third wall, the innermost of the three that stood, and he set his wand to it with the small contented patience of a man near the end of a long good job, and he unpicked it, strand by strand, and it gave, because it was only a made thing, and he was the best breaker of made things left in Britain, and the binding ring came apart, and Grieve stepped through the place where it had been, onto the flat stones of the path, 3 feet from the doorstep, 2-1. And he lifted his eyes from his work to the child he had come to carry off, and he set his foot at last on the threshold stone, on the keystone, on the goblin iron driven into the mortar at dawn, on the motherward sleeping in the blood of the boy in the stone of the house, on the exact square of the world that a woman named Helga had taught a boy to build across 1,000 years for exactly this. And Harry woke the last ring. He did not shout it. There was nothing to shout. The unmaking had no word, because words were the maker's way, and this was older. He only turned the whole of himself toward the sleeping thing under the stone, the way you turn toward a door you have been standing before your whole life, and he thought the one thing the winter had taught him to mean with the entirety of his small being. The keeping his mother had begun, and the iron singers had deepened, and he, last of the line, had finished. Not him. Not here. Take it apart. And the unmaking woke. It woke slowly, and then all at once, the way the tide turns, the way the dawn comes, the way a held breath is finally let go. And what came up out of the ground in that moonlit Surrey garden was the oldest magic the island had ever held, risen for the first time in 1,000 years, and it was terrible, and it was beautiful, and there was no cruelty in it anywhere, which was the most terrible and most beautiful thing of all. The founder line under the earth blazed awake along its whole buried length, and the 3 broken rings did not stay broken, because the last ring did not repair them, it remembered them. It lifted the whole design out of the mere marks Grieve had unpicked and stood it up again in something deeper than paste and iron, in the living grammar itself, so that the turning and the crossing and the binding rose again all at once around the house, in rings of a light that was not quite light. A shimmer in the dark, like heat over summer stone, like the air after lightning, like the inside of a shell held to the ear made visible, and the whole garden filled with the deep, unhurried hum Harry had felt the first night in his own teeth, the sound of a thing 1,000 years old opening its eyes. And in the center of it, on the keystone, stood a lean gray man who broke walls for a living, and had never in his life seen a wall like this. Grieve understood at the last, an instant too late, which is the only way his kind ever understands. He felt the ground change under his boot, and he knew, with the deep animal knowledge of 30 years spent in dangerous places, that he had walked into the one thing he had told himself did not exist, a trap laid by a warder better than he was a breaker, and he did the thing that men of his make always do in the last instant, which is to reach for the loudest thing they own. He raised his wand, and he did not reach for a binding now, nor a snare, nor any of the careful professional tools of the man who takes his prize whole. He reached cornered for the killing word, the last resort of the maker, the sentence that ends all argument, and he spoke it, full into the face of the child on the doorstep, a bolt of green that was the absence of everything, the curse against which the whole loud modern world agreed. There was no defense, no shield, no counter, nothing but to not be standing where it fell. The whole loud modern world had forgotten the unmaking. The green bolt crossed the 3 feet between the man and the boy, and it never reached him, because the unmaking met it in the air and read it, faster than any wand had ever been read, found the 4 parts of it, the hate at its head and the ending at its heart, and the child named as its object, and the wand of a broken man for its anchor, and it took the sentence apart from the end, unpicked it, unsaid it. Unmade the killing word. In the half-instant it hung in the dark between Grieve's wand and Lily Potter's son, so that the green light came undone into the nothing it had always been built from, and fell, harmless as ash and silence, onto the stones of the path, and the deepest curse the makers ever made guttered out a foot from the boy it had been thrown to kill, exactly as it had once before, 7 years and a world ago, in a cottage in Godric's Hollow. On a night this same boy had been too young to remember, and had carried in his blood ever since. For the second time in his life, a keeping made of love unmade the killing word over Harry Potter, and this time he was awake, and this time he had built it himself, and the understanding of that went through him like the hum through the garden, and he would carry it, unnamed and enormous, for the rest of his life. Grieve stared at the ash on the stones. He had thrown the killing curse perhaps 40 times in his long gray career, and it had never once failed, because it did not fail. It was the one certainty in his uncertain trade, and it lay now in cinders at the feet of a 7-year-old, and Mordaunt Grieve, who had not been afraid since he was younger than the boy in front of him, was afraid. He turned to run, and the wall would not let him. The binding ring took him where he stood. It did not throw him or crush him or do any of the loud things a maker's magic would have done. It simply, with the vast unhurried patience of the founder's work, declined to let him move, closed around him not as a fist but as amber closes around a fly, so that Mordaunt Grieve stood rooted on the keystone with his wand still raised and his mouth still open on the ghost of the word that had failed him, held fast, held gently, held completely, by a keeping that had no anger in it at all. And then the unmaking which had eaten his killing word turned, without haste, without malice, and ate the rest. It unpicked the magic off him strand by strand, as he had unpicked the crossing ring, and it was the most precise and least cruel violence Harry had ever witnessed. It took apart the Cursebreaker's tools laid out on the lawn, unmade the snare of cold light that still bound Harry's arm so that the boy's arm came free, and the feeling flooded back into it. Unwove the long dark spells Grieve had spent 30 years sewing into his own skin to make himself hard to catch and hard to kill, unpicked the very charms that had let a wanted man walk the roads of Britain for 7 years unseen, until there stood on the keystone, held fast in amber light, only a lean, gray, tired old man with an empty wand and an empty mouth, and nothing left in him at all of the thing that had made him dangerous, a man magically spent to the last thread, alive, unhurt, and utterly, finally unmade. The wall had done to him the one thing his whole loud life had been built to believe was impossible. It had, without raising its voice, refused to let him be what he was. Harry sat down on the doorstep. His legs had stopped holding him somewhere in the last minute, and he only noticed now. And he sat down hard on the cold stone with the whole great ward blazing quiet around him and a bound and hollow man 3 feet away. And he was 7 years old, and he had just turned aside the killing curse and unmade a professional and kept a house full of people who hated him. And he did the only thing a 7-year-old could do at the end of a thing like that, which was to shake all over in the dark. And let himself, for once, with no one who could use it against him, be exactly as frightened as he had every right to be. For a while he only sat, and the wall blazed its quiet blaze around him, and the bound man stood hollow on the keystone, and the garden held the deep, unhurried hum of the founder's work at rest after its one great labor, and Harry let himself be small inside it. He was aware, distantly, that he had done a thing, that the thing was enormous, that he would have to think about it. But the thinking would keep, and the shaking would not, and so he sat on the cold doorstep and shook and breathed and watched the light that was not quite light move slow along the risen rings. And he was, for a few minutes, in the middle of the largest magic in Britain, simply and entirely a tired, frightened child who had stayed up all night and won, and there was no shame in it, and he let himself have it. But the wall he had raised did not stay a secret of the garden, because a great ward, Helga had warned him, is the loudest thing a warder ever makes, and there is no hiding the raising of it, and this had been more than a raising. This had been the founder's work woken whole for the first time in 1,000 years. The killing word turned, a Cursebreaker unmade, the deepest grammar in the world sung at full voice in a Surrey night, and the note of it went out from number 4 along every buried line and every deep root and every thread of the old keeping still left anywhere in the island, and the island felt it. Under the northern hill, the weft rang from end to end. It rang as it had rung the night the first mark was laid, but where that had been a single far-plucked thread, this was the whole cloth sounding at once, a chord out of the deep past so vast and so clean that every goblin in every hall stopped and stood, hammers stilled, ledgers forgotten, and turned toward the south as one, because the thing their eldest had gone to find had not merely woken, it had stood up and answered and won, and the deep halls that had kept their faith alone for 1,000 years knew, in the space of that one ringing chord, that they were alone no longer. In a round tower 400 miles north, every silver instrument on every spindle-legged table cried out at once, the delicate wire and the smoked glass and the whole quiet orchestra of Dumbledores watching shrilling together in a single note that had no name in any of his catalogues, and the old wizard, already half into his cloak, already moving, understood from the pitch of it that he was hearing a thing no living wizard had ever heard, and would very likely never hear again. And that it was happening in the garden of the house he had chosen, around the child he had left there, and that he was going to be too late to see it and only in time to survive it. And across the sleeping country in ones and twos, the last few who could feel such things felt it. An old witch in a Cornish cottage set down her tea and wept without knowing why. A hag under a bridge in the north lifted her head and grinned at the dark. Every creature that had ever been called a beast by the wandkind, and had kept in its long memory the older knowledge of what the wandkind had chosen to forget, felt the founder's wall rise in Surrey, and felt, with it, something none of them had felt in 1,000 years, which was that the keeping had come back into the world, that somewhere a child was doing the old true magic openly and well, and that the long cold age of the makers, the loud forgetful age that had buried the warders and salted their graves, had just in a garden no one important had ever heard of met the first gray light of its ending. None of them knew it was a boy of 7. That would come later and slowly, and would be, to most of them, the least believable part of a story that strained belief in every particular. For now they knew only the wall and the answer and the winning and the sudden strange unlooked-for hope of it, and they turned it over in their old hearts through the last of the night and did not sleep. And in the house itself, 10 feet from where the killing curse had guttered out on the path, the 3 Dursleys slept on. They slept the flat, untroubled sleep of people the hush had folded the whole night away from, Vernon snoring his long, deep saw, Petunia dreaming of a garden with no weeds in it, Dudley sprawled and drooling in a room full of toys he had already broken, and not one of them stirred. Not one of them would ever know that a man had come in the dark to murder the nephew they despised, and had been turned by a wall the boy had built under their begonias. That a goblin and a wizard were about to meet as equals on their lawn, that the child in the cupboard had that night done a magic their whole world believed impossible, and had spent his last strength, the very last of it, keeping the three of them alive inside their ignorance. They would wake in an hour and want their breakfast. And Harry, sitting on the doorstep in the failing dark, looked back once at the dark windows of the house that had never wanted him, and understood that this, too, was the craft, this was the deepest truth of the keeping, that the best kept are the ones who never learn they were in danger, and that he had given the Dursleys the one gift the Dursleys were constitutionally unable to receive, which was a night of mortal peril they would sleep straight through and never thank him for, and that he did not, sitting there, mind. He had not done it for thanks. He had done it because he was a warder, and a warder keeps, and that was all, and that was everything. And it was Anaug the goblin came first, because the goblin had been closest, and the goblin had felt the nail. Bragnock came up out of the deep roads and into the garden through the Founderline itself, which opened to him because Harry had promised it would, a friend gate folded into the wall for a goblin, the first goblin in 1,000 years to walk through a wizard's ward as a welcomed guest, and he came fast, faster than his 200 years should have allowed, and he stopped at the edge of the blazing rings and looked at what a child had made, and the walnut face did a thing Harry had not seen it do, which was to go still with something that was not calculation. He looked at the risen wall, the 4 rings and the keystone, the founder's work standing whole in a Surrey garden. He looked at the ash of the killing curse on the stones, which he read at a glance for what it was, because the Iron Singers forget nothing, and he had seen that particular ash exactly once before, in a ruined cottage he had been sent to survey a long 7 years ago. And he looked at the small, shaking boy on the doorstep, and at the hollow-bound man on the keystone, and Bragnock, elder of the Warders' Guild, keeper of the deep weft, who had not bowed to a wizard in 1,000 years, went down on one knee on the wet grass, slowly, deliberately, so the boy would see it and understand it, and he bowed his old head to a child, and he said in the goblin tongue and then in English so there could be no mistaking it, "The bridge stands. The Badgerwitch is answered. I have lived long enough," and Harry, shaking on the doorstep, looked at the oldest warder in Britain kneeling to him on the Dursleys' lawn, and could not speak, and did not need to, because Bragnock had not knelt to be answered. He had knelt because a thing he had waited 200 years to see had happened in front of him, and some things are owed any whether or not the one who caused them understands. The old wizard came second, and he came too late, exactly as he had feared, and he had the grace to say so. Dumbledore arrived at the edge of the garden in the grey before dawn, with his traveling cloak thrown on over his nightclothes, and his wand in his hand, and 40 years of terrible readiness in every line of him. Ready to fight a thing that had already been fought, ready to save a child who had already saved himself. And he stopped at the turning ring, and the turning ring, remembering him, opened, because Harry chose to open it, and Albus Dumbledore walked into the garden of number 4 and saw, in the risen light of the Founder's Wall, everything that had happened while he was 400 miles away being, for once in his long-arranging life, too slow. He saw the ash. He saw the bound and hollow man whom he recognized, because Dumbledore forgot nothing either, a Death Eater 7 years thought vanished, standing spent and harmless in a child's keeping. He saw the goblin kneeling. He saw the wall. And last of all he saw the boy on the doorstep, small and shaking and unhurt, and Albus Dumbledore, who had come to be the one who arrived in time, understood that he had been given this once, the rarer and harder gift of arriving to find that he had not been needed, and he lowered his wand, and he stood a long moment in the light of a magic older than his own. And then he did the second wholly unselfish thing he had ever done about Harry Potter, which was to say, into the ringing quiet, in front of the goblin and the boy and the hollow man, "I was wrong. I have been wrong about you for a very long time in ways I am only beginning to count. You did not need me to keep you. You have kept yourself in this house, and even, I think, the people in it who did not deserve it, better than I kept you when I laid you on their step and walked away. I am sorry. It is a small word, and I have earned no right to a larger one." Harry looked up at him. He was too tired and too young to know what to do with an old man's apology, and so he did the thing he did with everything too large to hold, which was to set it aside to be looked at later in the ledger on some night when his hands were not shaking. But he heard it. He heard that it was true, and true this time in a way that was not being used, and he put it where he kept the few true things that had ever been said to him, which was a very small shelf, and not empty any more. They dealt with Grieve as the dawn came up. It was the goblin's right, Bragnock said, and Dumbledore, who might once have argued it, looked at the wall and the ash and did not. And Harry understood that something had shifted in the world that morning that would not shift back, that a wizard and a goblin were standing in a garden agreeing on a thing, quietly, as equals, over the bound body of a man they had both failed to stop, and that the agreeing had been made possible by a 7-year-old who had built a door where there had only ever been a wall. Grieve would go under the hill to answer to the Iron Singers for the wards he had broken and the master he had served and the foundercraft he had come to steal, and Harry did not ask what goblin justice was, and Bragnock did not offer, and both of them understood that a boy of 7 had seen enough of the deep things of the world for one spring, and need not see that one yet. The hollow man made no protest. There was nothing left in him to protest with. He was led away down the roads of the earth by a people he had spent his life taught to despise, and the garden was quieter for his going, and Harry never saw him again, and thought of him afterward only rarely, and always with the cold clear pity of a warder for a maker who had built his whole self on the one thing a keeper knows to be a lie, that power is for taking. And then it was only the three of them in the garden, the boy and the goblin and the old man, in the first proper light of a spring morning, with the great ward dimming back down to its sleeping shimmer around a perfectly ordinary house on a perfectly ordinary street where 3 ordinary people slept on, warded, unknowing, kept. For a moment none of them spoke, and in the quiet a thing happened that Harry was too young to weigh the whole of and old enough already to see. The goblin and the wizard looked at one another across the boy on the doorstep. They had known each other, in the distant formal way of powers, for the better part of a century, the headmaster and the elder of the Warders' Guild, and in all that time they had spoken perhaps a dozen times, and every one of those times had been a negotiation, master and beast, wand and gold, the old cold arithmetic of a world that had broken between their two kinds 1,000 years before either of them was born. Now they looked at one another over the ash of a turned killing curse and the sleeping shimmer of a founder's wall, and the arithmetic was simply gone, dissolved in the same unmaking that had eaten Greaves' magic, because both of them had just watched a child do the impossible thing neither of their peoples had managed in a millennium, which was to make the two of them stand in one garden and want the same thing. Bragnock inclined his walnut head to the old wizard, a fraction, the first courtesy an Iron Singer had paid a Hogwarts headmaster in longer than the school had stood, and Dumbledore returned it deeper, and neither of them said a word, because there were no words yet made for what had shifted, and both of them were old enough to know that the wrong word spoken too soon can break a thing the right silence will let stand. Harry watched the two of them not speak, and understood dimly through the fog of his exhaustion that he had done more than turn a thief. He had, without meaning to, only by being what Helga had made him, put a crack in a wall 1,000 years thick, the oldest wall in his world, the one between the wandkind and the deep folk, and that the crack would let through in time he could not guess what but light, he thought, some kind of light. He was 7, he had been awake all night. He had turned the killing curse and unmade a professional and kept his enemies and cracked 1,000-year wall between two nations, and the largest of these, at that grey moment in his tired child's reckoning, was none of them. The largest was that he wanted, more than he had ever wanted anything, for it to be over, for the garden to be only a garden, for someone to tell him he had done well and let him sleep. And no one did, because the two who stood with him did not yet know how to speak to a child they had just watched become a legend, and Harry sat with the wanting unmet, as he had sat with 1,000 wantings unmet, and he did the thing he had always done, which was to fold it small and put it away and wait for the world to remember he was in it. It was Dumbledore who remembered first, and it was the beginning, though neither of them knew it then, of everything that came after between them. "The world will have felt this," said Dumbledore at last, gently. "All of it. What rose here tonight was felt in every warded place in Britain and beyond. There will be questions, Harry. There will be people, some like me and some very much not, who will want to know what woke in Surrey and who did it and how. I cannot make that not so. But I can, if you will let me, stand between you and the worst of it for a while and teach you nothing and take nothing, and only keep the door I have spent your whole life failing to keep. It is late for me to offer it. I offer it anyway. And the deep halls," said Bragnock, rising at last off his old knee, "offer what they offered before, and it is not changed, and it is not an oath, and it never will be. A door, bridge, left open. You have proven what you are past any doubting, and the Iron Singers do not forget a thing proven. When you are grown and ready, and if you wish it, there is a place under the hill where the last of the deep craft has waited 1,000 years for a wizard who would come as a keeper and not a master, and you are that wizard, and it will wait as long as you need, because we are very good at waiting, and you have given us, this morning, the first reason in 1,000 years to think the waiting was not in vain." Harry sat on the doorstep in the growing light, with an old wizard on one side offering to keep a door and an old goblin on the other offering to leave one open, and he understood that he had arranged, at the age of 7, out of a buried book in a winter of nights, the one thing Helga had said might one day be possible, and had not promised he would live to see. A wizard and a goblin, the two halves of a world that had been broken for 1,000 years, standing in a garden and offering, both of them, to keep faith with the same child. He was too tired to feel the size of it. He felt only the cold of the stone and the ache of his freed arm and the deep spent quiet of the sleeping wall, and under all of it, faint and warm and steady, the thing his mother had left, which had held again and held now and would go on holding. There were things to be arranged, and they arranged them in the growing light, the three of them, with the plainness of people who have stopped needing to impress one another. The world's questions would come, and Dumbledore would meet them, because meeting the world's questions was a thing he was better at than any wizard alive. He would let it be known in the right quiet quarters that an old founder relic long buried in the south had woken and spent itself and been contained, which was true in every particular and concealed the one particular that mattered, and the curious would be satisfied, and the dangerous would be disappointed, and the name of a boy in Surrey would stay, for as long as Dumbledore could manage it, out of the story entirely. It will not hold forever, the old man said honestly. Secrets of this size never do. But it will hold for years, I think, and years are what a child most needs, and I have grown, lately, ashamed of how little of your childhood I troubled to protect. Let me protect this much of what is left of it. Let me buy you the years. And Harry, who had learned to weigh the old man's every offer for the calculation braided through it, weighed this one and found, to his surprise, that the calculation and the kindness pointed, this once, the same way, and he nodded, because a warder takes the keeping that is honestly offered, whatever the hand it comes from. He would stay at number 4. That was decided quickly, and it was Harry who decided it, and the deciding surprised the two old powers who had half expected to be asked to carry him somewhere better. But Harry looked at the sleeping house, at the wall he had raised around it, at the disguise the Dursleys made for him without ever knowing they made it, and he understood that there was no safer place in Britain for him now than the one nobody would ever think to look, the grey unremarkable house of the grey unremarkable family, with a founder's fortress asleep beneath the begonias and a boy inside it who had learned to be the plainest bread in England. He would stay and be underestimated and grow and study, one mark a night, one page at a time, as he had done everything, and let the world go on believing that whatever had happened in Surrey had happened to a relic and not a child. You would rather, said Dumbledore, watching him with a look that held more than one thing at once and would not settle on any, keep your own wall than be kept behind mine. I've been kept behind other people's walls my whole life, said Harry. This is the first one that's mine. And the old man inclined his head because there was no answer to that, and he did not try to make one. Before he went, Dumbledore did one small thing, and it was the most human thing Harry had ever seen him do. He knelt stiffly, an old man in night clothes and a traveling cloak on a wet lawn, so that his eyes were level with the boy's, and he looked at Harry for a long moment, at the green eyes and the untidy hair and the scar and the whole small, solemn survivedness of him. And he said very quietly, not as a headmaster, and not as a general moving a peace, but as an old man who had known two people who were dead, "You have your mother's eyes." I have not let myself say it in 6 years, because saying it would have meant looking at what I did with the child who had them. She would be so proud of you, Harry, that I think it would frighten her. They both would. And then he rose and drew his cloak about him and was gone, folding sideways out of the world, and Harry stood in the garden holding the sentence he had been given. You have your mother's eyes, they would be proud, and he did not put it in the ledger to be looked at later. He looked at it now. He had earned it now. He let himself have it once in the empty garden before he folded it away for the harder days to come. Bragnock was the last to go, and he did not go before he had walked the whole wall once slowly, reading it, the 4 risen rings and the keystone and the friend gate folded into every one of them, and when he had read it all he stood before the boy and did the thing goblins do instead of embracing, which is to name a debt. The deep halls owe you a mourning, he said. We do not forget a debt and we do not forgive one, and a debt owed is a stronger bond by far than any love, for love may cool and a debt is iron. You have made the Iron Singers your debtors this night, wizard child, the first wizard to hold that place since the Badgerwitch, and we will pay in the coin of the deep folk, which is patience and craft, and the door under the hill left open against the day you come to walk through it. Build well, grow. And when the Maker's world grows too small and too loud around you, as it will, remember there is a hall in the north where a thing you do is measured by whether it is true and not by whether it is seen. And he set his old cracked hand for a moment against the doorstep, against the keystone, against the goblin iron he had given and the motherwort it stood upon, as a smith sets his hand to a joint he has judged and found sound, and then he turned and walked into the founder line and down into the roots of the earth, and the garden was empty, and the light came up gold over the fences of Privet Drive, and it was, at last, only a garden again. He went to the shed when they had gone, the goblin down into the earth and the old wizard sideways out of the world, both of them with promises made and a door each to keep. And he opened the box one more time before the Dursleys woke, and he set his thumb to the last page, the one he had never been able to reach, the one that had stayed pale and sleeping no matter how he pressed, and this morning, with the wall risen and answered and the killing word unmade a second time over his blood, the ink woke. It woke gold, the last gold in the book, and it was short, and it was the last thing Helga ever said to him, written 1,000 years before he was born by a woman who had guessed, across all that dark, exactly what a careful and needful child would most need to hear on the morning he finally became what she had built the stone to wait for. Thou hast raised the wall, she wrote, and turned the ending, and kept even thine enemies, and so I know, though I am dust, that I was not wrong to trust the one who lifted the stone. Here is the last thing, and it is not a keeping, for thou hast keepings enough now to teach the world that forgot them. It is this: thou hast spent thy whole short life being told what thou art by people who did not know. Thou art not the boy in the cupboard, thou never wert. Thou art a warder, the newest of the oldest craft in the world, and thou art the bridge, and thou art loved, hast always been loved, wert loved before ever thou couldst know it, by mother who kept thee with her death, and by an old woman who kept thee with her book, and I do not doubt in time, by more than thou canst yet imagine. Thou knowest thy name now, anchor in it. And when thou art grown, and hast learned all I could leave thee, and gone under the hill, and learned what I could not, do the one thing I never managed in all my long life, which is this: teach it, do not bury it again. The world buried the keeping once, and has been the poorer and the crueler for it 1,000 years. Thou art the chance to give it back. Be the warder who does not hide the craft in the ground, but hands it openly to the next careful and needful child, and the next, until the world remembers what it forgot, that before ever a wizard learned to make, a wizard learned to keep, and that keeping in the end is only the other name for love. Harry read it 3 times, as he read everything, and then he closed the box, and he sat in the shed in the new light with his mother's warmth under his ribs, and a goblin's iron in his keeping, and an old wizard's promise on the wind, and a 1,000-year-old woman's last words in the ledger where nothing could ever take them. And he understood at last, all the way down, the thing the name Anchor had been waiting for him to know. He said his own name to himself in the quiet, as he had never once in his life heard it said, not the freak, not the boy, not the Potter boy, in the tone of a warning. Harry. Harry Potter, who was a warder and was kept and was loved, and had a wall of his own making standing sleeping around a house that had never wanted him, and a door under a hill in the north, and a whole long life ahead in which to learn the deep craft and grow into the name, and one day give the keeping back to a world that had thrown it away. He sat a while longer in the shed after the gold words had faded, in the ordinary morning light that came through the open door, and lay in a warm bar across the potting bench and the paint tin and the box that had waited 1,000 years in the ground for exactly him. There was so much still to learn. The book was not finished. The book, he understood now, would never be finished, because a warder's book is only ever the beginning of a warder, and Helga had written down what she could and trusted the rest to the years and to the child and to the deep halls in the north where the oldest of it still slept. He would go there one day. He would learn what a book could not hold. He would grow into the name and give the keeping back to a world that had thrown it away, one careful and needful child at a time, until the quiet art was quiet no longer, but common, ordinary, unremarkable. The way the maker's wandwork was ordinary now, so that some far-off boy in some far-off cupboard would find, when he most needed it, that the keeping had never been buried at all, but handed down openly, warder to warder, all the long way from a founder's grave to his own small, frightened hands. That was the work. It would take a life. Harry had a life, all of it still ahead, and for the first time it looked to him less like a sentence to be served and more like a wall to be raised, one true mark at a time, and he found he wanted to raise it. He was 7 years old. It was a spring morning. The kettle would want putting on soon, and the bacon turning, and Aunt Petunia would come down and find a reason to be cross, and none of it would touch him, because he had built a wall the first wizards would have knelt to and hidden it under her begonias where she would never, in all her small gray life, so much as suspect it stood. He got up off the shed floor. He hid the box behind the paint tin. He crossed the wet grass in the first sun of the year, unseen, unhurried, kept, and he let himself in through the old door to begin the ordinary morning, the plainest bread in England, a boy of 7 with the lost wardcraft of the first wizards awake and whole in his careful hands, and the whole of it, all of it, only just begun. Chapter 7 End.